Hi guys, and welcome to Calm Night Radio Channel. Tonight we slip into the rawly uncertain world of the American frontier in 1830, where a family can leave a tidy little farm in the east and wake weeks later under open sky, listening to wolves somewhere beyond the trees and wondering if they have made a brilliant choice or a truly terrible one. What makes ordinary people trade a proper roof for a wagon cover, a familiar church bell for the creak of harness leather, and neighbours they know for a horizon that seems to keep moving away from them? So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And as you get comfortable tonight, tell me your location and your local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, and you find yourself standing in the damp chill of an early spring morning, where the yard of a small eastern homestead looks strangely crowded and strangely bare at the same time. Nothing feels normal anymore. The hens still peck near the fence. The smoke still rises from the chimney. The family dog still circles your boots and sniffs at the air as if this morning were like any other. Yet the house itself has already begun to look like a place you're leaving, not a place you belong to. Doors hang open. Chairs are stacked awkwardly. Bedding has been rolled into tight bundles and tied with cord. Iron pots wait on the ground beside seed sacks and wooden chests. It is the odd magic of departure. The home is still standing, but in spirit it has already become memory. You're not alone in the yard. Around you moves a pioneer family, busy and half silent with the seriousness of the day. The father checks wagon wheels with a practiced hand, pressing the rim, examining the hub, glancing toward the horses as though they alone hold the answer to the journey ahead. The mother counts parcels twice, then once again, with a face that looks calm only because she cannot afford panic. A grandmother, wrapped in a shawl that smells faintly of lavender and wood smoke, sits on a chest and holds a tin cup in both hands. She watches everything. She misses nothing. Children drift between excitement and fear so quickly it is almost funny. One moment they chase each other through the mud. The next they stare at the wagon as if it were a ship about to carry them off the edge of the world. In 1830, many American families moved west for reasons that were practical, hopeful, and deeply personal. Land in older settled areas could be expensive or already divided into small parcels. Soil in some places had grown tired from repeated planting. New roads, river routes, and land sales pulled people toward territories that seemed full of possibility. Some wanted more acreage. Some wanted independence. Some simply wanted a fresh start after debt, crop failure, or family trouble. The frontier was often described as opportunity in buckskin boots, though the boots were usually cracked, wet, and full of mud. You can feel that hope in the yard, but it is tangled with dread. The wagon itself is less grand than people later imagine. It is sturdy, yes, but not heroic. It smells of grease, damp canvas, raw wood, and old grain. When your hand touches the sideboard, the timber feels rough, nicked, and splintery beneath your fingers. Every inch of space matters. There is no room for sentiment unless sentiment can earn its place. A feather bed might come because sleep matters. A spinning wheel might come because cloth matters. A Bible nearly always comes because faith matters, and because a family without many books often clings hard to the few it owns. But a fine table too heavy, the extra chair too awkward, the nice blue plate from Aunt Sarah, a luxury until it shatters on the first bad rut. So choices become brutal. A child begs to bring a toy. The mother hesitates, then tucks in a rag doll with one stitched eye. A teenage boy wants a fishing spear, though no one is quite sure there will be room. A little girl slips a polished stone into her apron pocket and tells no one. Small treasures travel quietly. Historians still argue whether pioneer families expected these moves to feel temporary at first, or whether most already understood, deep down, that leaving meant cutting themselves loose from one life forever. Either way, the emotional weight of departure was enormous, even when the language around it stayed practical. The sounds of the morning sharpen around you. Harness buckles click, rope rasps over wood. A baby fusses with that thin, breathy cry that seems louder in cold air. Somewhere across the road, a neighbour calls out a final blessing. You hear boots in wet soil, the slap of a pail set down too hard, the old familiar complaint of a gate hinge. Sound carries differently on a leaving day. Every ordinary noise seems to ask whether you will ever hear it here again. The smell is just as vivid. Cold earth, manure, ash from last night's fire, bacon grease clinging to a pan that has already been packed, damp wool cloaks aired out for the trip. There is also the smell of anxiety, though of course nobody would call it that. It is the sour edge of sweat on clean clothes. It is coffee gulped too fast. It is the sharpness of horses sensing that they are expected to work. The father lifts a seed sack and sets it deeper into the wagon. He's bringing the future in canvas bags. Corn seed, bean seed, perhaps some wheat, perhaps not. Such choices depend on region and ambition. Alongside the seed goes a small axe, a broad axe, a handsaw, an auger. Iron nails saved in a pouch, and maybe a skillet blackened by years of reuse. These are not just tools. They are the first draft of a new household. Without them, a family on the frontier is only camping. With them, it has a chance to begin. A chance, that is the key phrase. People often picture pioneer life as one long parade of bravery, all jawlines and sunsets. The reality was more ordinary and more exhausting. Families worried about money constantly. They worried about distance, weather, sickness, and whether the rumour of good land was actually true. They worried about legal titles, animal health, broken wheels, and the possibility that a river crossing might undo the entire enterprise in 10 terrifying minutes. Even deciding when to leave mattered. Too early and spring and roads became swamps. Too late and the planting season at the destination could be missed. The frontier was full of big dreams and very annoying logistics. You watched the mother perform a final walk through the house, her shoes whisper over the floorboards. The rooms are nearly empty now, and emptiness changes their sound. She runs her fingers across a mantle polished by years of elbows and dusting rags. She checks the hearth, though no fire remains. On a shelf sits a single wooden spoon somebody forgot to pack. She takes it, smiles without humour, and tucks it into her apron. Frontier history often celebrates men chopping trees and staking claims, yet women were just as central to migration. They managed stores of food, clothing, soap, candle moulds, kettles, blankets, and medicines. They remembered which child had the cough, which sack held the dried apples, which shirt still needed mending, and which corner of the chest contained the family papers. Nothing about this was glamorous. Everything about it was essential. Outside, the children have been told to climb in. They do so with the drama of tiny emperors sent into exile. One complains about the cold, one asks whether there will be bears, one asks whether bears can climb into wagons, another wants to know if Indians live in every forest. Such questions reflect the uneven knowledge of frontier families in 1830. Some travelled into regions already dotted with settlements, mills, and roads rough enough to deserve the name. Others moved into places far less developed from their perspective, though of course these lands were not empty. Native nations lived, traded, farmed, hunted, and travelled across them long before American settler families arrived. That fact shaped frontier life completely, though many pioneer accounts were frustratingly blind to it, or described it with fear, prejudice, or rumour rather than understanding. A quirky little truth slips in here. Some families carried live chickens tied inside the wagon, or perched in makeshift crates, because eggs were useful, chickens were valuable, and apparently chaos was considered an acceptable travel companion. You can imagine the flapping, the smell, the sudden indignant clucks every time the wheel hit a rut. History is full of noble speeches, yes. It is also full of poultry behaving badly. The grandmother is helped up, her joints protest. You can almost feel the stiffness in your own knees as she settles among the bedding. Her hand rests on a quilt pieced from scraps of older clothing. That quilt is a history book without words. Here is a square from a wedding dress. There is one from a work shirt, another from a child's outgrown frock. On the frontier, fabric was not wasted lightly. Worn garments became patches, linings, baby wraps, rag strips, and quilts. Touch mattered in a life with little softness. Wool scratched, linen cooled the skin, fur warmed the hands. A good quilt felt like wealth. At the gate, neighbours gather. Some have come to help, Some have come to witness. Some, if they are honest, have come because another family's departure confirms that restless itch in their own hearts. The United States in 1830 was a country in motion, though not everyone moved and not every move succeeded. One neighbour presses a small paper packet into the mother's hand. Flower seeds, perhaps. Another gives dried herbs for stomach trouble. A third shakes the father's hand with painful firmness and says something cheerful that nobody quite believes. Farewells on the early frontier could be tender, awkward, and blunt all at once. There might be prayer. There might be tears. There might also be practical advice about axle grease and forward depth, because sentiment alone never got anyone across Ohio. The wheels finally roll. It is not a dramatic lurch. It is slower, sadder, and somehow more convincing. The wagon groans forward, leather straps strain, hooves suck free from the muddy yard. A child twists around for one last look at the house. You feel that look like a tug in your chest. The house seems smaller already. The chimney, once so important, thins against the pale sky. The orchard near the fence, still bare from winter, waits for a spring bloom the family may never see. Departure is rude that way. It does not pause for appreciation. It simply begins. Road travel in 1830 could vary wildly. Some routes followed established roads with taverns, ferries, and scattered settlements. Others were crude traces through forest, prairie, or cut-over land. Even where roads existed, they could be miserable in wet weather. Deep mud swallowed wheels, rocks punished axles, dust in dry spells coated mouths and eyelashes until every face looked faintly baked. Travellers rose early, moved by daylight, and made camp or found lodging by evening. Progress was measured in miles, but also in annoyances. A broken trace chain could steal hours. A lame horse could wreck a schedule. A lost cow could inspire language not fit for a bedtime channel. You travel with the family through that first long day, and the rhythm of movement starts to settle into the body. The wagon sways. Boards creak under shifting loads. Your feet feel the uneven ground each time you walk beside the team to lighten the weight. Cold morning gives way to a milder afternoon carrying the smell of thawing earth and crushed grass. Crows call from bare trees. A creek chatters over stones. Once. The breeze brings the sweet scent of sap where maples have been tapped nearby. For a moment, the world feels almost generous. Then someone remembers what has been left behind. Not an object, a person. Perhaps an older son apprenticed in town. Perhaps a sister newly married. Perhaps graves in a churchyard. This is one of the quiet pains of frontier migration. A family did not only move away from comforts, it moved away from kin networks, burial places, and the small habits of belonging. Letters might travel eventually, but slowly and uncertainly, visits could become impossible. A pioneer family often carried loneliness west long before it unpacked anything else. By dusk, the road has turned from novelty into labour. The children are cranky and sticky with the day's grime. The mother rubs her temples. The father walks with a hitch in his step that he pretends not to notice. Camp is made near water if possible, though not so near as to invite flooding or the worst insects. Blankets come out. A kettle is hung. Cornmeal mush or fried salt pork may appear if supplies allow. Supper is simple and never decorative. Smoke from the fire clings to your clothes and hair. Sparks lift into the dimming blue. The horses lower their heads to feed, steam ghosting from their backs in the cool evening. The family eats with that frontier combination of gratitude and fatigue which makes even plain food seem worthy of silence. Tin cups warm stiff hands. A spoon scrapes the pot. Beyond the firelight, darkness gathers under the trees with almost theatrical seriousness. The air smells of smoke, leather, damp leaves, and supper grease. The touch of the ground through a blanket is unkind. Roots announce themselves. Stones seem to multiply under every shoulder blade. Yet there is also a strange intimacy in this first camp. The family has not arrived anywhere, but it has fully left. That matters. In the firelight, faces look older. The grandmother murmurs a prayer. A child falls asleep mid-complaint, mouth slightly open, one hand still curled around a crust of bread. The mother stares into the coals, perhaps calculating food, miles, weather, and courage all at once. The father listens to the night sounds with careful attention. Frogs begin, insects hum, a branch cracks in the woods, probably nothing, though nothing can sound impressive after dark. Scholars continue to debate how many pioneer recollections later exaggerated danger in order to turn hardship into family legend. Memory enjoys a little theatre. Even so, the uncertainty was real enough when you were lying under canvas with your whole future packed beside you. Overhead, the sky clears. Stars spread in a cold, patient sweep. There is no town glow to soften them. They look close enough to trouble you. You lie there with the smell of smoke in your blanket and the ache of the road in your bones, listening to the soft breathing of strangers who have already begun to feel like companions. This is how frontier life starts for many families in 1830. Not with a triumph, not with a dramatic speech, with sore muscles, practical fear, and a hope so stubborn it survives embarrassment, weather and common sense. Sleep comes slowly, but it comes. By the time the sun lifts through a pale veil of morning mist, you're already learning the first hard lesson of frontier travel. A family cannot bring its whole life west. It can only bring the parts that earn their place. The wagon stands in the grey light like a test no one quite passes. Its wooden frame looks broad from a distance, yet up close it feels absurdly small. Every inch has been argued over. Every bundle has a reason. Every extra pound threatens the horses, the wheels, and the patience of everyone involved. You stand near the open tailboard and watch a mother unpack half the wagon only to pack it again. This is not confusion. This is frontier mathematics, and frontier mathematics is cruel. The Dutch oven is too heavy to sit near the axle unless the seed sacks shift forward. The box of cured meat cannot rest under the wash kettle because damp will ruin it. The candle moulds fit neatly in a corner, but only if the skillet rides beside them, and the coffee pot nests upside down inside a larger pan. A chest of clothing looks innocent until someone tries to lift it. Then it becomes a personal insult. Nothing is casual here. Packing for the frontier in 1830 meant thinking less like a traveller and more like a tiny moving village. A family needed tools for building, cooking gear for daily meals, bedding for warmth, spare clothing, food that would not spoil too quickly, medical basics, and the few objects that gave a household structure. That usually meant axes, hatchets, knives, a saw or two, iron pots, tinware, blankets, rope, nails, fishing line, seed, and maybe a firearm if the family owned one. It also meant accepting that many familiar comforts would stay behind. Fine furniture, large mirrors, extra crockery, thick rugs, and decorative items often lost the battle. The frontier had little sympathy for elegance that could not chop wood or boil beans. The father grips a barrel and tests its weight with a low grunt. Salt pork. Useful. Valuable. Stubbornly heavy. Beside it rests a sack of cornmeal, another of flour, and a smaller pouch of dried beans. Food on the move had to be simple, durable, and filling. Bacon, smoked ham, jerked meat, meal, hard bread, dried apples, and sometimes molasses or coffee if the family could afford the luxury. You can almost smell the blend rising from the supplies. Sharp salt, dusty grain, faint sweetness from fruit leather. The earthy smell of burlap sacks rubbed by rough hands. Children drift around the packing site like curious little officials with no authority and many opinions. One kneels beside a crate and pokes at a bundle of spoons wrapped in cloth. Another tries to sit on a feather mattress and is told to get off it at once. A teenage girl folds linen shifts with quick, efficient motions that suggest she already knows childhood is not a protected state out here. A younger boy drags a stick through the dirt and asks why they cannot just bring the kitchen table. The answer is obvious to every adult and emotionally unacceptable to every child. It is not only weight that matters, shape matters too. A barrel rolls differently than a chest. A sack slumps into corners. A bundle of tools can wedge against the wheel well, but only if tied tightly. Empty space is the enemy. Empty space lets things bounce, crack, and grind themselves to pieces. That is why quilts are used not only for sleeping, but also for padding. Softness has work to do. A folded blanket becomes a shock absorber for crockery. A spare shawl protects the family Bible from rubbing against ironware. A worn coat stuffed into a corner stops a lantern from rattling itself into ruin. You begin to understand why so many surviving accounts of wagon travel sound obsessed with lists. Lists were survival. Lists told a family what it had, what it lacked, and what could not be replaced. Soap, thread, needles, pins, awls, extra shoe leather, a small mirror, a whetstone, a comb, bandages, lard, salt. These things might look dull on paper, yet each one carried the quiet power to prevent misery. Frontier life was often shaped more by the presence or absence of one practical object than by any grand idea of adventure. The mother lifts a small wooden box onto her lap and opens it with the care of a priest unveiling relics. Inside are medicines, or at least the 1830 version of medicines. Dried herbs in paper twists, a tin of salve, a vial of laudanum, perhaps, if the family is fortunate or reckless. Sulphur, castor oil, a little camphor. Remedies varied, and many were uncertain in effect. Some helped, some did little. Some probably made life more dramatic than necessary. Historians still dispute how much confidence ordinary families truly had in frontier home medicine, because diaries sometimes showed deep faith in household remedies and deep frustration with them at the same time. It turns out human beings have always liked pretending they know what they're doing while privately hoping for the best. Clothing makes up another awkward problem. Fabric was expensive and garments were labour, not fashion. Every shirt, petticoat, apron, stocking, and pair of trousers represented spinning, weaving, sewing, trade, or cash. So a family packed clothing with respect. Everyday wear mattered most. Strong linen shirts, woolen dresses, work trousers, cloaks against rain, mittens if the region required them. Hats were not decorative nonsense. They were portable shelter. Shoes were priceless and never numerous enough. Many families also brought scraps of cloth because old fabric could become patches, baby wraps, bandages, or ties for bundling kindling. On the frontier, a rag was only a rag if your imagination had failed. You notice how everything smells faintly of the house it came from. Clean linen carries the scent of soap and chestwood. Wool smells warm and lanolin rich. A shawl holds a trace of fireplace smoke. Even iron tools carry the cold mineral scent of a barn corner or workshop shelf. Packing is not merely logistics. It is a dismantling of atmosphere. The very air of a home seems to be folded into bundles and tucked into the wagon. There is a strange tenderness in the handling of bedding. Feather ticks are beaten, rolled, and tied with rope. Coverlets are folded flat. Quilts are stacked where they can be reached at nightfall. Sleep on the frontier was serious business. A family without enough bedding was not uncomfortable in some charming rustic sense. It was cold, wet, stiff, and wretched. Touch ruled these decisions. Canvas scratched, rough boards bruised, damp ground crept upward into bones. A good blanket could feel like civilization itself. One object at a time, the household becomes portable, a skillet with a soot-black belly, a pewter spoon worn thin at the bowl, a spinning wheel broken down into pieces for transport, a cradle, maybe, if an infant makes it essential, a churn, sometimes, though that depends on space and ambition. You might imagine that a family setting out for a new life would travel light and optimistic. In fact, it often travelled dense and anxious, weighted by iron, seed, and necessity. Hope was there, certainly, but hope rode under the frying pan. The father pauses over a stack of books. There are not many, perhaps a Bible, an almanac, a primer for children, and one treasured volume of sermons or poetry. Books were valuable and heavy, which is a frustrating combination. Yet many families carried them anyway. Reading mattered, not only for faith and schooling, but for identity. A book could turn an evening into more than labour and darkness. It could also serve as a keepsake of a world that felt settled and literate, even when the wagon road ahead promised neither. One of the more curious items, sometimes packed by pioneer families, was a packet of garden seeds far more delicate than staple crops. Marigolds, hollyhocks, pinks, maybe even rose cuttings wrapped in damp cloth by an especially stubborn woman who refused to believe that survival and beauty had to quarrel. It is a lovely little detail, and a practical one too. Flower gardens signalled permanence. They said, "We mean to stay." They also softened the severe appearance of a cabin yard and pleased the eye after months of mud, stumps, smoke, and toil. Even on the frontier, people wanted colour. They were not all walking around admiring turnips. The children are eventually told to choose one personal item each. This creates immediate moral crisis. A boy stares at a carved whistle, a smooth stone, and a ragged cap with equal seriousness. A girl clutches a doll with yarn hair and a face nearly rubbed off by love. A teenager folds a letter and tucks it into a pocket with more care than any adult notices. Such choices carry more weight than they seem to. Personal objects helped preserve a sense of self inside a life dominated by labour. They were tiny anchors against strangeness. Not all packing happened in a single wagon, of course. Some families used pack horses, some travelled with multiple wagons, some moved in smaller stages, shipping goods by river where possible and overland where necessary. Roads, waterways, and destination all shaped strategy. A family bound for Ohio might plan differently than one pushing into Illinois, Missouri, or farther borderlands. Yet the core challenge remained the same. The household had to be stripped down to its working bones and then balanced on wheels. You hear the scrape of a chest lid and turn toward an older woman sorting tableware. She rejects several fragile pieces at once. The china cup with the little blue rim stays behind. The cracked serving dish stays behind. The everyday bowls go. Tin plates go. Wooden trenchers go. There is almost comedy in how quickly sentiment loses to durability. Tin will dent but survive. Wood can be scrubbed and mended. Glass and delicate ceramics are frontier optimists. They break just to prove a point. A practical family also packed trade goods if it could spare them. Needles, thread, cloth, tobacco, extra tools, and occasionally a bit of liquor might serve in barter once formal stores grew distant. Cash was useful, certainly. But on many frontiers it was not the only language. Exchange ruled daily life. A family might swap labour for corn, nails for help, cloth for butter, or a piglet for a favour too awkward to describe in polite company. Portable value mattered. A person who arrived with nothing but courage was admirable. A person who arrived with needles and salt was welcome. The horses shift and stamp while the wagon grows heavier. Leather creaks, a fly lands and is flicked away. The harness smells strong, warm, and slightly sour in the morning heat. Sweat darkens the animal's shoulders. Their labour sets the true limit of this migration. However cleverly the family packs, the team must pull it. Overload the wagon and disaster waits patiently at the first steep grade. Underpack it and you risk facing the wilderness without enough tools, food, or bedding. This is why packing a wagon could stir more argument than a church meeting. Voices rise. The father says the second iron pot is too much. The mother says the second iron pot is non-negotiable. He says they can make do with one. She asks, very calmly, whether he plans to boil laundry, stew meat, render fat, and heat water for washing in the same vessel on the same day. He does not answer quickly enough. Frontier marriages contained affection, duty, strain, and many debates about objects whose significance only became clear once daily work began. Scholars sometimes point out that men's and women's priorities in packing could diverge sharply, not because one side was wiser, but because their expected labour differed. A man might favour tools and feed, a woman might insist on bedding, cookware, and textile supplies. Usually both were right, which is an irritating result for anyone hoping to win the argument. You notice a hidden layer in all this. Packing is also an admission of fear. The more uncertain the destination, the more fiercely a family clings to preparedness. Extra twine means fewer disasters. Extra socks mean fewer blisters. Extra salt means food lasts longer. A spare knife means one broken blade does not leave you cursing a stump with bare hands. Each practical item whispers the same private thought. What if we cannot get another? By late morning, the wagon is nearly full. Its interior has become a compressed map of family life. Food low and central, tools tucked where they can be reached, clothing chests secured, medicine box protected, bedding layered over fragile things, small children perched where they will not tumble out at the first rut. Nothing about the arrangement looks elegant. It looks earned. A frontier wagon was less a vehicle than a puzzle solved in wood, rope, and anxiety. Then comes the hard part. What still remains on the ground? A stool with only one loose leg, a basket of kitchen odds and ends, a spinning basket too bulky to justify, a cracked lantern, a stack of old newspapers useful for wrapping but too awkward to save. The leftovers sit in the dirt with the sad dignity of rejected auditioners. Some will be sold, some gifted, some abandoned. This was one of the small heartbreaks of migration. A household was not only packed, it was edited. There is a hush when the final decisions settle. A child is lifted up. The tailboard is secured. Ropes are checked, then checked again. The father pushes against the load with both hands, testing for shift. The mother reaches in and adjusts one folded quilt because she knows that if one thing starts sliding, all peace will leave the wagon in the next mile. Her fingertips smooth the fabric once, almost absent-mindedly. That gesture says everything. The frontier will be rough. Let this small corner stay orderly while it can. A breeze moves across the yard, carrying scents of trampled grass and warm animals. Somewhere nearby, bread bakes in a neighbouring house that is not going anywhere today. The smell drifts over with almost unfair sweetness. For one ridiculous instant, the whole enterprise feels questionable. Why leave solid walls, known paths, familiar ovens, and cupboards that stay put? Why trade a shelf for a sack, a room for a wagon, and certainty for mud? Because the packed wagon is not only a loss, it is a declaration. It says a family believes it can make a home where none exists yet. It says that pots and quilts, seed and soap, books and bolts of cloth can become the framework of a future if carried far enough and used hard enough. It says that ordinary objects, arranged with enough care, might keep hunger away, keep children warm, keep illness at bay, and keep some small dignity alive when the weather turns mean. You look at the wagon one last time, dense with everything that matters, and it seems less like luggage than a stubborn piece of hope on wheels. The road does not welcome you. It merely allows you to pass, and even that feels negotiable. By the third morning of travel, the excitement has worn off like cheap dye in rainwater. The wagon wheels are already striped with mud. The horses look less noble and more employed. Every person in the family has learned a fresh discomfort, and several have learned too. You step into the day with sore calves, stiff shoulders, and that gritty feeling behind the eyes that comes from sleeping outdoors and waking before true light. This is the long road west in 1830. Not a line on a classroom map, not a dramatic ribbon of destiny. Just a difficult track through fields, forest, wet ground, and settlements spaced too far apart for comfort. Some stretches are broad enough to feel like roads. Others are little more than worn traces where wagons have gone before and punished the earth into reluctant cooperation. You move by wheel ruts, landmarks, rumour and habit. A bent oak, a creek bend, a tavern sign, a ridge that seems near until you spend half a day reaching it. Morning begins with a familiar choreography. Blankets are shaken. The fire is coaxed back to life. A kettle goes on. Someone rubs down the horses. Someone else checks the wheel pins and harness straps. The children, who had seemed lifeless at dawn, suddenly find strength when told to wash their faces in cold water. It is a miracle science has never properly explained. The smell of smoke rises at once, mixed with coffee if there is any left, or the plain scent of warming cornmeal if there is not. Damp grass brushes your boots. Your fingers sting in the chill. A bird calls from the trees with irritating cheerfulness, as though roads were invented for pleasure. Then the wagon creaks forward again. That sound becomes the steady voice of the journey. Wood flexing, iron complaining, leather pulling tight, hooves thudding. then sucking in mud, then striking firmer ground with a hollow knock. The long road has its own music, and none of it is subtle. Children fidget under canvas. A spoon clinks in a pot despite all efforts to secure it. The father calls to the team in a voice that is both command and encouragement. The mother answers questions without turning her head. People on the frontier did not have modern notions of ergonomic seating, which is unfortunate, because a jolting wagon can make a saint consider unkind thoughts. Travel often meant alternating between walking and riding. Adults walked whenever they could, partly to spare the horses and partly because not everyone fit comfortably in the wagon all day. You walk beside the family through rising dust that clings to hems and trouser legs. In dry weather, the road can turn powdery enough to coat your tongue. It settles into hair, eyebrows, and the folds of clothing until everyone tastes faintly of dirt. In wet weather, the same road becomes a sticky enemy that grabs at shoes and drags at wheels. The frontier was fair in one respect only. It made sure both mud and dust had their turn. By late morning, the first crossing appears. Not a grand river, just a stream wide enough to matter and shallow enough to tempt confidence. Water slips over stones with a bright, innocent sound. That is how trouble often presents itself. The father studies the ford. He watches the current. He looks for ruts entering and leaving the bank. A man who crossed here yesterday might have found it easy. Today one wheel could sink into a hidden hole and turn a simple crossing into disaster. Historians still debate how often family recollections exaggerated river danger, because danger makes for excellent storytelling, but no one disputes that water crossing could be tense, slow, and ruinously expensive when they went wrong. The wagon noses in, the horses hesitate, then lean forward. Water pushes around their legs. The current presses against the wheels. For one breathless moment, the whole load tilts just enough to make every adult imagine bedding soaked, food spoiled, tools lost, and children screaming. But the wheels catch the far bank. Mud spits, leather strains. The wagon climbs out with all dignity abandoned. Everyone exhales at once. A small child laughs because terror and delight are cousins. The mother does not laugh. She reaches back to feel a bundle of blankets, just to be certain. Roadside inns and taverns existed on some routes, but a travelling family could not count on them, and certainly not on comfort. When you pass one near noon, it looks less like romance and more like a transaction with weak stew. Chickens pick under the porch. A sour smell drifts from the stable yard. Men in travel-stained coats lean against posts and discuss weather, roads, land prices, and horses with the solemnity of scholars. News moves along these roads with the wagons. Who is heading west? Who turned back? Which bridge is damaged? Where fever has been reported? Which county seat is growing? Which ferrymaster cheats? For many families, the road itself becomes the first true newspaper they have seen in weeks. A meal at midday is brief and practical. Cold bacon, bread gone a bit hard at the edges, cheese if fortune smiles, dried apples, maybe a swallow of cider or coffee. Children want more than exists. Adults pretend not to be hungry yet. You sit on a log and feel bark rough through your clothes, the grain pressing against tired skin. Overhead the sky opens into a hard blue arch. Flies arrive instantly, as if summoned by law. One lands on the rim of a tin cup, another on a horse flank, and another directly where it will be most annoying. Frontier life had many enemies. Some were dramatic. Many had wings. The road after dinner seems longer than the one before it. Heat thickens. The smell of warmed leather and animal sweat grows stronger. The horse's flanks darken. A wheel hits a hidden stone, and the whole wagon gives a vicious jolt that knocks a child sideways and starts a baby crying. The father mutters something sincere but not church-approved. A woman walking behind another wagon on the road ahead stoops to retrieve a skillet that has bounced out of a loose bundle. So much of travel is simply preventing your possessions from leaving in protest. You begin to notice the other travellers more closely. A young couple with one cow tied behind their wagon, an optimism far exceeding their equipment. A widower leading 2 children and a mule. A larger party moving together for safety and company. A man with tools to sell. A family returning east with quieter faces than the westbound ones. Such meetings create a strange road society. People exchange warnings, estimates, recipes, gossip, and advice no one requested. They also stare at one another's loads with frank interest. A wagon announces priorities. If you carry extra axes, perhaps you mean serious clearing. If you carry many books, perhaps you're a minister or school-minded. If you carry a spinning wheel lashed to the side, everyone knows a practical woman is in charge somewhere. One quirky truth of overland travel is how often lost livestock complicated the day. Pigs wandered, chickens escaped, cows developed mysterious personal convictions about direction. Families who thought themselves ready for hardship could be humbled by a single determined goose. It is one thing to face the vastness of America. It is another to chase your supper through roadside brush while your children offer useless commentary. Clouds build by afternoon, rising in pale towers that slowly darken at the base. The air changes first. It grows close, metallic, expectant. Even the insects sound different. Then thunder rolls across the distance, not yet close enough to alarm, but near enough to move everyone faster. Rain on the road is never just rain. It is slipping hooves, slick banks, soaked bedding, chilled children, and hours of harder pulling. Canvas helps, but only within reason. Water has a genius for finding seams. When the storm finally breaks, it comes with impressive lack of manners. Rain drums on the wagon cover so hard conversation turns to shouts. The road darkens, softens, and begins its transformation into soup. Water trickles under collars and down backs. Hair clings to necks. The smell of earth leaps upward, rich and muddy and alive. Wet wool releases that heavy sheepish odour no one ever praises in poetry. A child cries because her shoes are full. Another announces with astonishing calm that he likes storms. No one thanks him for this information. The family pushes on until a patch of higher ground offers a place to stop. Camp in rain is an art practiced by people who do not enjoy it. The father cuts branches for a quick shelter line. The mother feels every blanket bundle for damp. Children are instructed to stand somewhere useful, which they interpret creatively. Smoke from a newly lit fire crawls low and stubborn, stinging your eyes. Still, the little blaze catches, her pot is set on. Wet hands hover over heat. The first sip of anything warm feels almost luxurious. You would cheer a plain boiled potato at this point. Night on the road has its own character, distinct from home and distinct from arrival. It is unsettled, temporary, and filled with little vigilance. Horses must be checked. Wheels should be blocked. Supplies need covering. Strangers nearby may be friendly or may simply be strangers. The dark beyond the fire can feel huge in a way town dwellers rarely understand. It is not just blackness. It is unmeasured space. Tree trunks stand like pillars. Frogs pulse from unseen water. Once in a while a far call drifts through the woods and everyone pauses. Not because the sound is necessarily dangerous, but because the imagination loves an opening. Frontier travel was also physically punishing in ways people seldom romanticize. Feet blistered, hands cracked, backs spasmed. Children developed rashes from dust and sweat. Women menstruated, conceived, nursed, and managed household labour through all of it. Which is one of those facts history quietly places on a shelf while admiring men pointing west. Older people suffered too. Stiff joints do not care about national expansion. Neither does a toothache. A family on the road carried all its ordinary human frailty with it, only now with fewer places to hide. At one camp, a traveller shares a story over the fire about finding wagon tracks swallowed by prairie grass and nearly turning south by mistake. At another, someone claims there is excellent land ahead, black soil and timber enough for 10 lifetimes. At another, a woman warns of fever in a settlement not far off. The road teaches by rumour. Some warnings are sound, some are nonsense. Some begin with a fact and end as legend. Scholars still disagree about how accurately emigrants judge distance and danger from road gossip, because fear stretches miles and hope shortens them. You wake one morning to fog lying low over the ground. It beads on the wagon cover and wets your sleeves. Sound travels oddly in it. Hooves seem near and far at once. A man's cough from another camp carries like a bell. The road ahead disappears 10 yards beyond the lead horse, which creates the unsettling impression that the whole family is rolling into blankness. Yet the wagon continues, because that is what wagons do. They keep moving unless broken, bogged, or outvoted by weather. As days pass, time itself changes texture. You stop counting by calendar and start counting by camps, creeks, ridges, ferries, and repairs. Yesterday becomes the place with the bad hill. Tomorrow is the place with the rumoured tavern. The world shrinks to practical concerns and grows vast in every direction at once. There is a kind of mental fatigue in that. The road never lets the mind sit down completely. One eye is always on a child, a horse, a weather sign, a wheel, a bundle, a ford, or the light fading too fast. Yet there are moments of unexpected beauty, and they arrive without asking permission. Deer stepping through morning woods as quietly as breath, sunlight flashing on a river bend after hours of rain, the smell of crushed mint underfoot near a spring, fireflies blinking along the roadside in warm dusk, so many at once that the dark seems to be thinking. A child falls asleep against a folded quilt, cheeks dusty, lashes clean where tears once dried. For a moment the road loosens its grip on worry and lets wonder sit beside you. Then a wheel sinks to the hub in a muddy stretch and wonder leaves without goodbye. Everyone climbs down, shoulders go under the spokes, the horses strain, road boots slide, mud claims ankles with vulgar enthusiasm, hands push against wet wood slick as soap. It takes grunting, swearing, shoving, and one very well-timed rock under the wheel before the wagon lurches free. The release throws 2 people backward into the mud, which would be funny if anyone were less tired. One child laughs anyway. Another begins to cry from sympathy, confusion, or simple atmospheric influence. The wagon rolls on, and the road records none of this. It never apologizes. By evening, the family makes camp on a rise with a view of open land stretching westward under a sky-striped gold and violet. The light softens every burden for a little while. Steam lifts from the horses. Supper smells of salt meat and onions. Somewhere nearby, another camp sings a hymn so slowly it sounds half asleep. The tune drifts through dusk with a kind of patient faith. You sit near the fire, feeling warmth on your shins and cool air on your back, and you realize the road has already changed the family, not into heroes, not into symbols, into travellers, dirtier, wearier, quieter, and oddly more capable than when they started. The stars come out one by one. Wheels stand black against the grass. A kettle lid clicks as it cools. The smell of rain has finally faded from the blankets. The long road west is still ahead in all its ruts, delays, and arguments with geography. But tonight the wagon is upright, the horses are fed, the children are drowsy, and the fire holds steady. On a frontier road in 1830 that counts as a very respectable kind of victory, you arrive at a place that barely deserves the word arrival. The wagon stops at the edge of a clearing hacked from timber and brush, and for a few quiet seconds nobody climbs down. The family simply stares. This is the promised ground. This is the patch of frontier that's supposed to become shelter, safety, and daily life. Right now it looks like a rough interruption in the forest. Tree stumps jut from the earth like broken teeth. Brush lies in ragged heaps. The soil is churned, rooty, and uneven. A few blackened circles mark old fires. Somewhere close by, hidden beyond the trees, water can be heard moving over stone. That sound matters. A cabin can wait a little. Water cannot. The first hours on a new claim are full of labour so basic it feels almost prehistoric. Before anyone dreams of windows or shelves or even a proper door, the family must answer blunt questions. Where will they sleep tonight? Where will the horses be tied? Where can a fire be made safely? Which side of the ground drains best in rain? Which trees are worth cutting first? The frontier has no interest in ceremony. It expects immediate competence from people who are often improvising. You climb down into air that smells of sap, fresh chips, damp leaves, and old smoke. A recent cutting always has a distinctive scent. It is green, raw, and slightly sweet, mixed with the sharpness of split wood and bruised bark. underfoot. The ground is springy in one spot, hard in another, and annoyingly full of stubs that seem designed to catch a careless boot. Mosquitoes drift near the wetter edge of the clearing. Flies appear wherever the horses stop. Overhead, the light falls broken through half-standing timber, making the place feel both open and unfinished. The father wastes no time. Men on the frontier often measured their worth by how fast they could turn wilderness into structure, which was a heavy burden to lay on one pair of shoulders. He checks the tree line, judges the timber, and marks out a likely cabin site on slightly raised ground. Nearby stands enough straight wood for wall logs, though not without effort. The ideal cabin location balances several needs at once: high enough to avoid the worst damp, close enough to water for carrying, near wood, but not so buried in dense timber that felling trees becomes dangerous and endless, too exposed, and winter wind becomes a personal enemy, too shaded, and dampness settles into everything from boots to bedding. The mother is already thinking in another direction. She looks for a place to set the cook fire, somewhere with room to work and little danger of sparks reaching bedding or dry brush. She notes where supplies can be stacked under a temporary cover. She checks the children, who are half thrilled and half bewildered. One is sent to gather small sticks. Another is told to keep the younger ones away from the axes. A baby, unimpressed by the entire concept of settlement, begins to cry. Before a cabin exists, families often lived for a time in makeshift shelter. A wagon served as storage and partial refuge, but not as a long-term answer. Canvas could be stretched into a lean-to. Branches might be laid into a rough roof. Some families arrived at claims with no building standing at all. Others found a previous settler's half-ruined cabin, an abandoned shanty, or at least a crude pen for animals. The famous log cabin of frontier imagination was real enough, but it did not spring fully formed from the earth with a cheery curl of smoke. It had to be sweated into existence, one log, notch, and blister at a time. The first evening's shelter may be no more than a sloping roof of canvas tied from wagon to poles, with quilts hung at the sides to cut wind. It looks pitiful by daylight and precious by dark. You help pull the fabric taut while rough rope bites into your palms. The canvas smells of dust, wagon grease, and old weather. Its edges slap softly in the breeze. Underneath, bedding is spread on whatever can lift it a little from the ground. Brush, poles, or a layer of dry leaves might serve beneath blankets if the family is lucky and the season is forgiving. Then the true building begins. Axes ring through the clearing with that bright, hard sound that seems to travel forever in the woods. The blows come steady at first, then slower as shoulders tire. Chips jump from the trunk. The smell of fresh cut oak or hickory rises thick and lively. Felling trees was skilled work and dangerous work. One wrong judgment of lean, wind, or hinge wood could bring a trunk down badly. Frontier men learned quickly or paid for mistakes with crushed limbs, wrecked tools, or worse. Neighbours often helped raise cabins when neighbours were available, and such help could be the difference between a rough start and a disastrous one. But not every family had nearby assistance, especially in more isolated districts. Sometimes a man and his older sons did most of the labour themselves, with women and younger children hauling, stacking, cooking, and tending all the other tasks that continue whether or not walls exist. A standard frontier cabin was usually simple and small, often only one room at first. Logs were cut, trimmed, dragged into place, and notched at the ends so they locked at the corners. The gaps between logs would later be filled with sticks and mud, or clay if available, in a process called chinking and daubing. A floor might come later. Sometimes the family lived first on packed earth. That little detail tends to quiet the romance quickly. Dirt floors are not charming after rain. They are cold, gritty, and gifted at producing mud exactly where you hope for rest. You watch the cabin walls rise slowly. Each course of logs heavier than reason says seems fair. Sweat darken shirts, hands redden. The father and an older boy strain with hand spikes while another steadies the end of a log. Their breath comes hard. The sound of wood rubbing wood is low and rough, like a growl. The mother brings water in a pail that feels far heavier on the return walk than on the way down. She also keeps the work fed, because hunger slows everything. Corn cakes, bacon, Maybe onions cooked in fat if there is time. Frontier construction always had a meal standing behind it somewhere, usually prepared by someone whose labour the heroic stories barely bother to mention. The children help in the irregular frontier way. They gather chips for kindling, they carry pegs, hold tools, fetch water, and ask highly inconvenient questions at the wrong moments. A small girl arranges stones in a serious little line and announces she is making her own house. A younger boy attempts to lift an axe with ambitions larger than his arms. He is corrected sharply. Childhood on the frontier included play, certainly, but it also meant being useful early and often. Even pretending to build a house was not entirely pretend when everyone around you was doing exactly that. One curious truth is that some pioneer cabins went up with surprising speed when enough hands were available. A community cabin raising could raise walls in a day. Roof, chimney, and finishing still required time, but the skeleton could appear almost miraculously. Of course, this depended on help, materials, experience, and weather. Without those, building could drag on and expose a family to miserable weeks of temporary living. Historians still argue over how comfortable early cabin life truly became within the first months, because later recollections often polished the hardship into virtue. A memoir written in old age loves a heroic fireplace. It is less interested in describing mice in the meal sack or rain dripping onto your blanket. The roof arrives as its own challenge. Split boards called clapboards might be made if timber and skill allowed. In rougher circumstances, bark, poles, and anything that shed water even imperfectly would be pressed into service. Every new layer overhead feels like a negotiation with the sky. Rain does not need much invitation. It taps, seeps, sneaks, and drips where a seam was trusted too much. You can tell a new shelter by the number of times a family looks upward during a storm. Then there is the chimney, that smoky symbol of domestic life. A good stone chimney was solid, durable, and laborious. Not every family could manage it at once. Some began with stick chimneys plastered thickly in clay. They worked, after a fashion, while also keeping everyone alert to the possibility of accidental excitement. Fire on the frontier was life, comfort, cooked food, dry stockings, and boiling water. It was also danger living in the middle of the room. A new fireplace smells of wet clay, ash, and smoke. It crackles with promise and mild menace. Inside, the cabin remains stark. Light slips through the gaps before chinking. Wind does too. The log walls smell clean and resinous. The touch of them is rough enough to rasp skin. Furniture, if present at all, begins in the humblest forms. A bedstead can be made by driving pegs into the wall and laying poles across them. A table may be little more than split slabs on trestles. Stools are treasured, shelves are progress. Wooden pegs in the wall become a wardrobe, pantry, an organisation system all in one. Nothing matches, everything earns its keep. The first night spent under a partly finished roof feels almost luxurious despite all evidence. You lie inside the shell of the cabin and hear sounds differently now. Rain on a proper roof, even a rough one, feels gentler than rain on open canvas. Wind has to work harder to find you. The fire throws amber light up the log walls and makes the corners darker by contrast. Smoke curls upward, mostly obedient. The room smells of sap, damp clay near the chimney, bacon grease in the pan, and the wool blankets warming under tired bodies. A baby's breathing softens. Someone coughs. A log settles with a tiny crack that sounds larger in the night. Shelter changes the mind. That may be the most important part. Out in the wagon or under a lean-to, the family is still passing through. In even a rough cabin, they begin to feel planted. Fear does not vanish, but it changes shape. The wilderness outside remains vast, inconvenient, and occasionally theatrical. Yet now there is a defined inside. An inside where boots can be pulled off, bread sliced, shirts mended, babies laid down, and tools leaned in a familiar corner. On the frontier, a wall was not only a barrier against weather, it was a statement that the world had been divided into yours and not yours. Women shaped that inside space quickly and with impressive stubbornness. The mother hangs a kettle where she wants it, not where chance left it. She folds bedding in a regular place. She claims shelf space for flour and meal. She shakes out a cloth and lays it over a crude table as though defying the wilderness to object. A broom of bundled twigs appears and begins combating dirt with admirable futility. Domestic order on the frontier was never trivial. It created rhythm and morale. A swept floor, even an earth one, told the family that chaos had limits. There is also the less charming matter of creatures who believe the new cabin belongs to them. Spiders discover corners immediately. Mice show a suspicious interest in grain sacks. Fleas, if invited by bedding, dogs, or plain bad luck, can treat the human settlement as a festival. Frontier homes were close to animals, weather, and soil in every sense. The line between indoors and outdoors was far thinner than later generations liked. A person could admire the sturdy cabin ideal by day, and still spend the night wondering what exactly had just scratched behind the wall. As the days pass, improvements gather. Gaps are filled with mud and sticks. A better door is hung. Deerskin or oiled paper may serve for a window, until glass can be obtained. Pegs multiply. A loft might be imagined. Outside, the yard begins to declare itself through use. Ashes dumped in one place, firewood stacked in another, a path worn to the spring, a patch marked for a kitchen garden. Stumps remain, of course, because stumps on the frontier possess the stubborn immortality of old opinions. Still, the clearing shifts. It begins to look less like a wound in the woods and more like a household trying very hard. Scholars continue to disagree about how isolated most pioneer families truly felt in the first stage of settlement, because much depended on region. Some claims lay near enough to others for regular help and conversation. Some stood lonely for miles, yet even where neighbours existed, the work of building shelter was so consuming that a family often spent long hours locked inside its own labour. Cabin building was both practical and psychological. It kept hands busy while minds adjusted to the fact that this rough little structure, smoky and unfinished, was now home. At dusk, after another day of hauling, chopping, and fitting wood to wood, the cabin glows from its doorway with a modest flickering light. The fire within smells warm and alive. Steam rises from wet shirts hung near the hearth. A pot murmurs. The rough table holds tin plates and a loaf cut unevenly by tired hands. Outside, the forest darkens and the insects begin their evening music. Inside, the family leans toward the warmth. Face is tired, hair carrying bits of sawdust and smoke. The shelter is plain. The walls are raw. The chimney may behave only on alternate days. The floor might still be dirt. Yet a roof now interrupts the night above you, and the fire answers the dark with steady light. On the frontier in 1830 there was not a small improvement. It was the beginning of safety, the beginning of routine, and the first hard proof that a family could build more than hope. Morning begins before the light has properly decided to arrive. You wake to the thin grey edge of dawn pressing through the cabin opening, and the room already feels used. Blankets are tangled. A child sighs in sleep. Ashes rest dull and powdery in the hearth, waiting for someone to wake them back into flame. The air carries a layered smell of cold smoke, damp wool, stored meal, and yesterday's labour. Frontier homes in 1830 were not places where people eased gently into the day. They lurched into it because work was waiting and work had no patience. For women on the frontier, that work was endless. It did not come in neat categories. It did not begin at 1 hour and end at another. It spread through the whole day, crossing from fire to field to wash kettle to cradle and back again. A woman might rise first to stir coals, knead dough, and warm water before anyone else had fully opened their eyes. By noon she could be cooking, mending, nursing a baby, carrying water, scolding children away from danger, and checking a pot before it boiled over. By evening she was still moving, still lifting, still counting supplies in her head while others were nearly spent. The romantic frontier imagination loves a heroic cabin bathed in sunset. It is less fond of the woman who has been standing in smoke and steam since before dawn. The fire must come first. Without it, there is no warm food, no boiled water, no heat to soften the hard edge of morning. You crouch near the hearth and feel the chill in the packed earth under your feet. The mother leans in with practiced movements, blowing gently into the ashes until a red eye opens deep within them. Dry shavings catch. A twig snaps. Then the flame rises with a soft, hungry sound. Smoke climbs and curls, smelling of oak and soot and the faint grease of old meals. Your hands reach toward the warmth automatically. Heat on cold fingers feels like forgiveness. Breakfast is simple, but simple is not the same as easy. Cornmeal mush must be stirred. Bacon, if there is bacon, must be fried without wasting drippings that might be useful later. Bread dough needs attention. Coffee, when available, is treated with the respect due a miracle. Frontier women managed food with a precision born of scarcity. Every pinch of salt, every spoon of lard, every scrap left in a pot had value. Waste was not a moral failure in some abstract sense. It was future hunger in disguise. You watch her move through the tiny room, stepping around sleeping children and stacked tools without hesitation. She knows where everything is even when the cabin is dim. Tin cup on the shelf, wooden spoon hanging from the peg, cloth over the rising dough, water bucket near the wall. The touch of the day is rough from the start. A kettle handle burns hot through a folded rag. Dough sticks cool and tacky to the fingers. A wooden bucket bites into the hand when lifted full. On the frontier, domestic labour was physical labour, not a decorative cousin of it. Then there is water. A household consumes a startling amount. Water for cooking, water for drinking, water for washing faces, hands, cloth, babies, bowls, floors, and sometimes wounds. If the spring or creek lies downhill, every full bucket returns heavier than memory claims. If it lies uphill, the trip feels like a personal insult from geography. You walk the path with the mother and hear the creak of the bucket handle, the rustle of skirts through brush, the faint bird song rising from the trees. At the spring the air feels cooler, earthy and mineral fresh. The water smells clean in the way only moving water can. She dips carefully to avoid stirring mud. Then she lifts, straightens, and begins the return with shoulders already braced. The wash is another battle altogether. Laundry today vanishes into machines and comes back smelling cheerful. On the frontier, laundry was hot. Wet labour that consumed half a day and nearly all goodwill. Shirts, shifts, stockings, towels, cloths, and baby linens must be soaked, rubbed, boiled, wrung, rinsed, and hung. Soap could be homemade from lye and fat, which sounds practical until it meets your skin. The wash kettle steams, wet cloth slaps wood, fingers redden in hot water and rough scrubbing. The whole yard smells of soap, wet fabric, ashes, and the sour edge of worn clothing finally giving up its secrets. Nothing stays clean long. That is one of the more humbling truths of cabin life. Children track mud, ash drifts, soot settles, smoke finds cloth and hair alike. A swept floor can look defeated by noon. Yet women swept anyway, scrubbed anyway, shook bedding anyway. Cleanliness on the frontier was never perfect, but it mattered deeply. It reduced illness where it could, preserved cloth longer, and offered a sense of order in a life determined to scatter itself. A broom made of bundled twigs scratching across the floor becomes one of the house's constant sounds, right beside the kettle lid and the crying baby. Cooking alone could fill most of a day. Bread had to be made from scratch. Meat had to be salted, smoked, stewed, or stretched with beans and corn. Vegetables, if the season allowed them, had to be peeled, chopped, boiled, or dried. Butter had to be churned. Milk had to be handled quickly before spoilage. Preserves required sugar, fruit, clean jars if any existed, and attention that could not wander. Even a modest meal depended on labour invisible to anyone who sat down just in time to eat it. You see this clearly when dinner is prepared. The mother does not merely place food on a table. She carries wood, tends flame, lifts iron, measures meal by habit, and keeps one eye on a toddler inching too near the hearth. The smell of onions in fat rises into the cabin and briefly transforms everything. Hunger sharpens. Children gather at once as if summoned by invisible bells. A pot simmers with a low, bubbling murmur. Steam dampens the air. Heat pushes against your face and neck. She tastes, adjusts, stirs again, and serves last. Women also made and repaired clothing, a task so constant it almost merged with breathing. Shirts tore, knees wore through, stockings needed darning. Buttons vanished with supernatural confidence. A frontier household did not throw garments away because seams failed. It patched them. It turned old dresses into smaller dresses, worn shirts into diapers, scraps into quilts, and scraps too small for that into rags. Needlework happened in every margin of time. A hem while the pot boiled, a patch while the baby slept, a seam by firelight after the rest of the family had begun to droop with fatigue. The cabin in evening is often full of this quiet industry. You hear the small pull of thread through cloth, the click of knitting needles if there are needles, the sigh of someone shifting on a stool, the low crackle of the fire settling. Lamplight or candlelight softens the room into amber and shadow. The smell changes too, growing waxy, smoky, and warm with bodies close together. A woman bends over a shirt and squints at tiny stitches while trying not to waste precious light. Her hands are chapped from lie, nicked from work, and still astonishingly precise. One quirky detail from frontier life is that some women kept bits of newspaper, old letters, or even pages from worn almanacs to use as patterns for cutting fabric. Paper itself could be precious. So could straight pins, which were easily dropped and infuriatingly hard to replace. A single lost pin could provoke more sincere sorrow than a modern person would grant an entire spoon drawer. Childcare folded into every task because it had to. Babies were nursed, rocked, soothed, and carried while chores continued around them. Toddlers had to be watched with the constant low alertness one reserves for small creatures determined to greet fire, water, knives, and livestock personally. Older children could help, but they also created work in the ordinary childlike ways. They skinned knees, they tore sleeves, they got underfoot, they got sick. They got hungry half an hour before the meal was ready and somehow again shortly after eating. Sickness made women's labour even heavier. A feverish child still needed sponging, coaxing, and comfort. An older relative with aching joints needed help rising or settling. A husband injured in clearing land still had to be fed and likely resisted being idle with the theatrical gloom of a trapped bear. Home care fell largely to women, along with whatever household remedies they trusted. Historians still argue how much frontier women relied on the inherited medical knowledge versus trial and error, because the line between the two was often blurred. A tea for coughs, a poultice for swelling, willow bark for pain, vinegar for cleaning, rest when possible. It was a medicine chest built partly from tradition and partly from hope. Then there were dairy tasks. If the family owned a cow, milking came morning and evening. The smell of the animal, warm and grassy and slightly sweet, clung to the pail. Milk had to be strained, cooled, skimmed, or churned. Butter did not emerge politely. It took rhythm and persistence, that repetitive thump and swish of cream in the churn, while your arms gradually questioned your life choices. Cheese-making demanded even more. The frontier table depended on such labour, yet later stories often glide past it as if butter simply floated into existence from patriotic enthusiasm. Gardening belonged in this world too. Women often managed kitchen gardens near the cabin, tending onions, beans, squash, greens, herbs, and whatever else the soil and season allowed. The garden was practical, but also intimate. It was close to the house, close to daily footsteps, close to hopes of fresh food after too many meals of meal and salt pork. Kneeling in the dirt, pressing seeds into warm soil, pinching back herbs, pulling weeds from between rows, a woman shaped the edge between subsistence and comfort. The smell of crushed tomato leaf, wild mint, or onion tops could make a rough yard feel almost civilized. Women's work was not limited to the home, either. During planting, harvest, butchering, moving, or emergencies, They worked outside as well. They hoed, they gathered, they helped with animals, they carried wood, they dried fruit, smoked meat, rendered fat into lard, and turned nearly every season into some form of preparation. The myth of strictly separate male and female spheres grows weaker the closer you stand to a frontier cabin. Labour crossed lines whenever survival asked it to, and still, within all that effort, women somehow made room for touches that were not strictly necessary. A clean cloth on the table, herbs hung neatly to dry, a child's hair smoothed and braided, a flower seed pressed into the soil near the doorway, a Bible placed carefully on the shelf instead of left in a corner. These small acts were not frills. They were declarations that life would be more than endurance. They insisted that a household could carry dignity into rough conditions and keep it there by stubborn habit. There was also emotional work, though no one in 1830 would have named it so neatly. Women soothed tempers, broke bad news gently, managed children's fears, remembered birthdays, preserved rituals, and carried the emotional weather of the household more often than anyone admitted. When food ran low, they still had to cook calmly. When a storm shook the roof, they still had to sound reassuring. When loneliness settled in, they still had to keep the day moving. A frontier cabin needed warmth from the fire, yes, but also warmth of spirit, and that rarely maintained itself. By night, fatigue sits in the room like another person. The mother lowers herself onto a stool with the care of someone whose back has argued all day. Her apron smells faintly of flour, smoke, and milk. Her hands rest for a moment in her lap, then reach automatically for something else to mend, fold, sort, or set right. Rest on the frontier was seldom pure rest. It was often work done sitting down. Yet there are moments, brief and easily missed, when the labour softens into something almost peaceful. A loaf turns out well and fills the cabin with rich, warm scent. A baby finally sleeps. Linen flaps clean on the line in good sun. Butter comes in the churn at last. The floor stays swept for nearly an hour. A child says grace in a serious whisper and forgets half the words. Everyone laughs, even the mother, especially the mother. Those little pauses matter. They are not freedom, exactly, but they are relief, and relief can feel heavenly when earned in teaspoons. So you sit in the cabin, as the firelight flickers on rough walls and the day's tasks finally loosen their grip. Outside, insects hum, and the dark gathers beyond the doorway. Inside, the kettle cools with soft ticking sounds. A shirt hangs freshly patched. Bread rests under cloth. The floor has been swept one last time. The children have quieted. The woman who carried the whole household through another day lets out a slow breath. Not because the work is done, but because for a few minutes it has stopped asking. On the frontier in 1830 that counted as luxury. Children on the frontier do not stay soft for long. The land, the weather, the work, and the narrow shape of daily life all press on them from the moment they can carry. Fetch, stir, or watch. You see it in the way they move around the cabin yard. They are still children, certainly. They laugh too loudly, ask impossible questions, and chase each other through dust as if the world were built mainly for games. Yet they also step aside for an ox team without being told twice, know where the water bucket belongs, and understand that if the hens get loose, supper may become very theoretical. A frontier childhood in 1830 could hold joy, but it was not protected from necessity. In settled towns, a child might have more chance for schooling, more neighbours close by, and more objects made purely for play. On the frontier, the boundaries between childhood and usefulness blurred very early. A 5-year-old could collect chips for kindling, a 7-year-old could mind a younger sibling for short stretches, a 10-year-old might help milk, gather eggs, pull weeds, scare birds from the corn, or carry water with impressive solemnity. By 12 or 13, many boys and girls were already serious contributors to family survival. Morning shows this best. The children wake not to leisure, but to instructions. Pull on your stockings or wash your face. Take this pail. Watch the baby. Fetch those eggs. Stay away from the axe. Do not spill the milk. The cabin fills with the rustle of linen, the thump of bare feet, the creak of the door, and the muttered complaints of young people who have discovered once again that chores are real. One small boy stands outside in the chill, hair sticking up like he has slept in an argument, and throws grain to the chickens with exaggerated misery. The chickens, naturally, are delighted. There is a kind of frontier comedy in how children adapt to hard lives while still remaining unmistakably themselves. A little girl carrying wood may pause to admire a beetle on the path. A boy sent to fill the water dipper returns 10 minutes late because he found tracks near the creek and felt called to investigate like a tiny, underqualified detective. A child told to mind the baby may succeed for 5 minutes, then become distracted by a frog, a feather, or the deep philosophical appeal of poking mud with a stick. Even so, the chores get done more often than not. The frontier demanded that they do. Boys and girls both worked, though their tasks often began to divide along familiar lines as they grew older. Younger children did whatever small jobs they could manage, gathering eggs, driving cows gently toward pasture, picking berries, collecting chips and kindling, scaring crows from the field, winding yarn, shelling beans, or rocking a cradle with one foot while sitting on the floor. Older boys might help clear land, split rails, plough, drive livestock, hunt small game, or carry messages across rough distances. Older girls often cooked, spun, sewed, washed, churned, gardened, and cared for younger children alongside their mothers. These were broad patterns, not rigid laws. Need overruled custom with refreshing bluntness. You watch a group of siblings move through the day like a tiny labour system. The eldest girl braids a younger sister's hair with firm, quick fingers before handing her a basket for beans. A boy no more than 9 drags an armful of sticks to the woodpile, dropping half and returning for the rest with great theatrical sighing. The smallest child follows everyone, carrying one feather, one stone, or one deeply unhelpful turnip leaf with enormous pride. Nothing on the frontier is quite separate. Work and family not together until even annoyance becomes a form of affection. Schooling existed, but unevenly. Some frontier children attended short-term local schools when enough families lived nearby to hire a teacher or build a schoolhouse. These schools might meet only part of the year, often when farm labour was lighter. A teacher could lodge with local families and rotate between homes in a little social arrangement that sounds cosy until you imagine 30 children reciting lessons indoors after a muddy walk. Where no school was available, parents or older siblings might teach reading, writing, and arithmetic at home if they had the skill, the books, and the time. That last part was often the trickiest. A primer, a Bible, an almanac, and a slate could educate a child surprisingly far when used steadily. Many frontier children learned letters by tracing them with a finger on a page or in dust on a table. They recited aloud because memory was cheaper than paper. The sound of the lessons in a cabin can be oddly soothing. A child spelling slowly near the fire, another whispering numbers under his breath, a mother correcting a word while kneading dough. Learning on the frontier was rarely elegant, but it could be stubborn. Scholars still debate how widespread literacy truly was in remote settlements during this period, because the evidence varies sharply by region, class, and family background. What is clear is that many parents valued learning even when daily life kept stealing hours from it. Books, when present, became shared treasures. A single volume might be read over and over until its corners softened and its spine gave up dignity. Children memorized stories, verses, and moral lessons, partly because books were few, and partly because entertainment was not delivered in an endless stream from a glowing object in the corner. A child on the frontier might know the shape of every tree near the spring, and every line in the family Bible with equal intimacy. That does not mean life was all duty and recitation. Children still played, of course they did. They played with whatever the frontier offered. Sticks became swords, rifles, horses, or fishing poles according to mood. Corn husks became dolls. Smooth stones became counters for games. A hoop, a rag ball, a carved whistle, a string trick, a race to the stump and back, a game of hiding behind the woodpile. All could occupy an afternoon when chores loosened their grip. Imagination was not a luxury item that needed importing from the East. It sprang up everywhere, A boy could become an explorer with one branch and an alarming amount of confidence. A girl could stage an entire domestic drama using acorns, cloth scraps, and 3 very patient chickens. One quirky detail from the period is that children sometimes played with dried bladder balloons from butchered animals, inflated and batted around like crude balls. It is the sort of frontier practicality that sounds inventive from a distance, and rather less charming when you stop to think about it too long. Still, fun has always been willing to compromise with available materials. Outdoor life sharpened children's senses in ways later generations often forgot. They knew the smell of rain before it reached the cabin. They recognized where mushrooms liked damp shade and where berries ripened first. They learned the sounds of the woods by ear, the high chatter of squirrels, the drumming of woodpeckers, the startled lift of hens when something moved where it should not. A child sent to fetch water at dusk might notice frogs beginning near the creek and understand that night was settling fast. The frontier taught attention, sometimes gently and sometimes not. It also taught caution. Fire burned, knives cut, wells, streams, horses, and wagons all carried risk. A child wandering too far could get lost with unsettling ease. A toddler near the hearth could turn one careless moment into family disaster. Parents on the frontier could not watch constantly, because labour demanded divided attention, so children were often taught rules early and firmly. Stay where you can hear my voice. Do not touch the musket. Mind the mule's heels. Watch your sister. Come in before dark. These rules formed a rough fence around a world that had very few actual fences. Not every lesson came kindly. Some came from pain, blisters from new shoes, splinters from rough rails, a sting from nettles, a tumble from a fence, the humiliating discovery that geese are stronger than reason suggests. Hardship-aged children in practical ways, though not always in the solemn style later adults preferred to remember. A child could weed a row like a labourer, then burst into laughter because a pig escaped into the garden. Both things could be true within the same minute. You notice too how quickly frontier children became comfortable around animals. Dogs, horses, hens, cows, pigs, and cats move through their world as fellow citizens with poor manners. A little girl scratches a dog's ears while reciting her letters. A boy ducks under a horse's neck with more confidence than seems appropriate. Another child talks to hens as though they are difficult old ladies, which frankly they are. Animals provided food, labour, warning, companionship, and endless opportunities for chaos. They also taught responsibility. Forget to latch the pen, and you may spend the afternoon explaining to your mother why the beans now look trampled and suspicious. Clothing for children wore hard and wore out fast. Knees tore, toes pushed through shoes, sleeves frayed, dresses shortened as girls grew, then were let down, patched, or handed along. Mothers mended constantly because children are active and cloth was precious. You can feel the textures of that childhood in every garment. The scratch of wool in winter, the coolness of linen in heat, bare feet toughened by summer ground, damp stockings after rain, a patched elbow that rubs a little stiffly until the cloth softens again. Meals shaped children's days too. Hunger arrived honestly after work and outdoor wandering. A bowl of mush, bread with dripping and beans, milk, or whatever the season allowed could vanish with startling speed. Children learned quickly that food did not appear magically. They watched it grow, gathered it, shelled it, fetched it, or helped preserve it. That knowledge could make them grateful, though not always polite. A hungry child on the frontier was still a child. He might still declare beans boring with the confidence of a king reviewing a feast. The emotional life of children on the frontier was more complicated than the heroic stories suggest. They could be lonely. Neighbours might lie miles away. Friends were not guaranteed. A child used to cousins, lanes, and village bustle could feel the silence of a scattered settlement very sharply. Even lively siblings were not always enough. Some children must have felt the loss of familiar places with quiet intensity. Historians still disagree about how deeply children understood migration's emotional costs at the time, since adults often recorded decisions while children's inner worlds went largely unwritten. But it is hard to imagine they felt nothing when familiar graves, houses, and faces disappeared behind them. At the same time, Frontier childhood could foster unusual confidence. A child trusted with real tasks learns the shape of competence early. You see it in the way an older girl lifts a kettle carefully without fuss, or the way a boy checks a gate latch twice because he knows what loose pigs mean. Responsibility could be heavy, but it also built self-possession. By adolescence, many frontier children had practical knowledge that later generations might never touch. How to start a fire from coals, how to spot weather signs, how to milk without being kicked, how to find the path home in dim woods, how to keep the younger children occupied while adults worked. There were moments of tenderness too, and they matter. A mother smoothing a boy's hair after scolding him, a father carving a toy from a scrap of wood at the door in evening light, siblings sharing the last sweet apple slice, a girl teaching her little brother a hymn while they gather chips. Childhood on the frontier was not all stern faces and relentless chores. It held warmth, teasing, small privileges, bedtime stories, and the special comfort of falling asleep utterly tired beneath a handmade quilt while the cabin fire settles into a red glow. As darkness gathers, the children quiet by degrees. One curls against the dog, another leans over a slate with the last of the light and then gives up. A little boy whose hands were black with dirt an hour ago is now scrubbed, sleepy, and offended by bedtime in principle. The cabin smells of soap, smoke, and warm bread. Crickets begin outside. Someone yawns. Someone else asks for a story, not because the day has been empty, but because the day has been so full that it needs gentling before sleep. You look at these frontier children and see something plain and remarkable. They're not miniature adults, though the work sometimes makes them seem so. They are children shaped by hardship, usefulness, curiosity, boredom, resilience, and play. They grow fast because they must. They imagine freely because that costs nothing. They labour because the family needs them. They laugh because children always will, even with dusty feet, patched clothes, and tomorrow's chores already waiting in the dark. Food rules the frontier more than pride ever does. You can speak bravely about opportunity, freedom, and new beginnings. But if the meal barrel runs low, all those grand words begin to sound thin. On the American frontier in 1830, a family's comfort, health, and plain mood often depended on what could be planted, hunted, gathered, traded, dried, smoked, salted, or somehow stretched one meal farther. You feel this truth the moment you step into the cabin at supper time and smell not abundance, but calculation. A pot hangs over the fire. It bubbles softly, not with luxury, but with intention. Something hearty is being coaxed from very little. Beans, perhaps, thickened with a scrap of pork, cornmeal stirred into mush on a better day, onions or turnips on a fortunate day, wild greens or a piece of fresh meat on a difficult day. The meal is mostly starch and hope. The smell can still be comforting. Smoke, hot iron, rendered fat, and the sweet dusty warmth of cornmeal carry a promise of fullness. Even when the promise is modest, you sit at the rough table and notice how everyone watches food without seeming to. A mother cuts slices with exactness. A father glances into the pot one extra time. Children ask what is for supper as though they have not already guessed by the smell. Hunger on the frontier was not always dramatic starvation. More often it was uncertainty, monotony, thin meals, and the constant need to think ahead. Enough for tonight was never enough by itself. A family needed enough for next week, for winter, for the failed crop, for the sick cow, for the rain that came too long, and the frost that came too soon. Corn stood at the centre of many frontier diets. It was dependable, versatile, and gloriously unpretentious. Cornmeal could become mush, johnny cakes, hoe cakes, dodgers, or bread baked in a skillet or before the fire. It filled the stomach and did not ask for elegance. Wheat bread existed, certainly, but flour could be harder to obtain or more expensive until mills were nearby and harvests reliable. Corn asked less of the land and gave back quickly. It was the blunt instrument of survival, and frontier families respected it even if they occasionally dreamed of better bread. Pork mattered too. Hogs were practical creatures for settlers, especially where woodland forage could help feed them. Salt pork, bacon, ham, and lard could support a household through long stretches when fresh meat was scarce. The smell of bacon in a cabin could transform the whole atmosphere at once. It was rich, smoky, and almost unfairly encouraging. Yet meat was not necessarily plentiful every day. A small amount might flavour a pot rather than dominate it. Fat itself was precious. Drippings were saved. Grease was useful. Nothing edible left the table lightly. Gardens, once established, softened the hardest edges of frontier eating. Beans, peas, onions or squash, pumpkins, cabbage, and turnips could all become reliable companions if weather and insects behaved themselves, which they often refused to do. A kitchen garden near the cabin was not decorative charity for the eye. Though it could be pleasing, it was a living pantry. The smell of crushed onion tops, warm soil, and tomato leaves, where tomatoes were grown, made the yard feel active and hopeful. Fresh vegetables broke the tyranny of meal and salt meat. They also reminded a family that the land could give more than timber and trouble. Still, the seasons always held the upper hand. Spring could be lean. Winter stores were low. Fresh growth had only begun, and the first successful planting was still a promise rather than a meal. Families might rely heavily on cornmeal, preserved pork, dried beans, and whatever remained in the cellar or loft. Summer could improve things with milk, eggs, greens, berries, and garden produce, though labour demands also rose. Autumn was the season of relief and alarm together. Harvest might fill the bins, smokehouse, and drying racks, but it also had to be gathered and preserved quickly. Winter then tested every decision. You hear the sounds of food work all around a frontier home, the scrape of a hoe in the garden, the rhythmic thump of a churn, the slice of a knife through squash, the pop of grease in a skillet, apples being pared, corn being shelled into a wooden bowl with a hard dry rattle, a kettle lid chattering over a boil. These sounds form the background music of survival. They are not dramatic, yet they carry the whole house. Hunting and fishing helped, though they were less magical solutions than later legend liked to suggest. A man or older boy might bring in deer, rabbit, squirrel, turkey, or fish depending on region, season, and skill. Fresh meat was welcome, but wild game was not an endless buffet waiting politely in the woods. It took time, ammunition, luck, and knowledge. Some game grew scarce near settlements as hunting pressure increased. Fish could be easier in some places, especially with nearby streams and rivers. But even then, the family needed the right season and the right conditions. Historians still argue about how heavily many frontier households truly depended on hunting after the first stage of settlement, because stories remembered venison fondly while account books often reveal a more ordinary reliance on corn, pork, and garden produce. One quirky frontier tidbit is the enthusiasm some settlers had for maple sugar, where sugar maples were available. In early spring, sap could be gathered and boiled down into syrup or sugar, giving a family a local sweetener at a time when store-bought sugar might be costly or distant. The boiling itself turned the air rich and fragrant, with that warm, sweet scent drifting through cold woods like a promise that winter had finally loosened its grip. Children often loved the process for reasons that remain deeply mysterious, only if you have never met a child near sugar. Then there were wild foods, berries, nuts, mushrooms, greens, and fruits could supplement the household if someone knew what to gather and when. Blackberries, huckleberries, walnuts, persimmons, wild plums, pawpaws, and more could brighten a frontier diet, depending on location. Yet gathering required knowledge and caution. The woods offered generosity, but not everything in them deserved trust. A wrong mushroom was not a charming adventure. It was an excellent way to ruin the day with lasting conviction. Milk and eggs were prized when a family had a cow and hens. Fresh milk could be drunk, skimmed, clabbered, churned, or turned into butter and cheese. Eggs could enrich a meal, stretch batter, or provide quick protein when meat was low. The smell of warm milk in a pail, grassy and faintly animal, belonged as much to the frontier as wood smoke did. A child carrying eggs from the henhouse learned quickly that breakfast could shatter in one clumsy moment. Fragility and value often lived in the same shell. Scarcity sharpened thrift into an art. Stale bread might be fried, soaked, or crumbled into something useful. Bones flavoured broth. Apple peelings could become vinegar. Fat was rendered. Salt was guarded. Flour sacks, once empty, still had work left in them as cloth or patches. The cook on the frontier was not only preparing meals, she was performing quiet acts of salvage day after day, turning leftovers into continuations. Waste was the enemy that crept in through carelessness. The table itself reflected this practical world: wooden trenchers, pewter spoons, tin cups, rough bread, a pot passed around, children waiting with impatience disguised as innocence. You feel the roughness of the table under your wrist, the heat of the bowl in your hands, the steam on your face as you lean over it. Supper might be plain, but after a full day of labour it could taste astonishingly good. Hunger is the finest seasoning, and also the least fashionable to discuss. Then there are the hard seasons. Drought could stunt corn. Too much rain could rot what drought had spared. An early frost could punish gardens. Insects could descend with organised cruelty. A sick hog, a dead cow, spoiled meal, or a failed hunt all tightened the household at once. You see the change in a family when food grows uncertain. Portions become smaller without anyone announcing it. Conversation grows sharper around the edges. Children ask for seconds and are distracted with stories or water. A mother scrapes the pot more carefully than before. The pantry shelf looks too visible. Winter carried a particular kind of food fear. Snow and cold narrowed choices. Fresh vegetables vanished unless well stored. Meat had to last. Corn and beans became central. Dried apples or pumpkin offered relief if they had been prepared in time. A family blessed with ample stores could face winter sternly but calmly. A family that had misjudged supply, suffered a poor harvest, or lost livestock entered the season with a dread no fire could quite warm away. The smell of an almost empty meal barrel is not dramatic, but it stays in the mind, dry, dusty, and accusing. Food preservation therefore mattered almost as much as food itself. Meat was salted or smoked, apples were sliced and dried, beans were shelled and kept, corn was cribbed. Pumpkins might be cut into rings and dried, cabbage could be stored cool, herbs were hung in bunches. The cabin or yard during preserving time had its own atmosphere. Steam in the heat, vinegar sharp in the air, smoke drifting from the meat house, flies needing to be chased away with grim dedication, hands sticky, stained, and busy from morning till dark. Communities could help soften hunger. Neighbours traded, lent, swapped seed, shared advice, and sometimes carried one another through a bad spell. A family with extra corn might exchange it for labour, cloth, or future repayment. A woman might borrow meal and return it after harvest. Hospitality remained important even when food was tight, which sounds noble until you imagine dividing a small loaf among unexpected guests. Still, many frontier households did it. Feeding another person was part of belonging in a precarious world. Children experienced all this in vivid ways. They knew which meals were cheerful and which were careful. They learned to gather berries when told, to shell beans, to keep hens from wandering, and to eat what was set before them with varying success. A child might still grumble over turnips, because some things are eternal, but he also learned the look on a mother's face when provisions needed to last. Hunger taught lessons quickly. So did the joy of a good harvest supper when the table finally looked generous again. There were rare treats, and they mattered greatly because they were rare. Molasses on bread, fresh apple butter, a pie when fruit and flour allowed it, honey, maple sugar, a special cake for a gathering. The smell of something sweet baking in a frontier cabin could feel almost luxurious, rich enough to make children hover like hopeful ghosts. Celebration was often edible long before it was decorative. Scholars continue to disagree about how varied frontier diets truly were from region to region, because memories compress monotony and local abundance in strange ways. One family might remember endless pork and corn, another might describe fish, venison, berries, pumpkins, and orchard fruit with some pride. Both could be telling the truth. The American frontier was not one uniform table. Soil, climate, markets, ethnicity, nearby towns, and family skill all change what ended up in the pot. Even so, one reality runs through nearly every account. Food demanded labour at every stage. It had to be planted, protected, butchered, carried, milled, cooked, preserved, and measured. A meal did not simply appear because the family had worked hard in some general way. It appeared because dozens of particular tasks had been performed correctly over weeks and months. One missed planting, one ruined barrel, one hungry animal in the garden, one stretch of bad weather, and the whole chain weakened. As evening deepens, the family gathers close to the hearth with bowls in hand. The cabin smells of steam, smoke, and something savoury enough to quiet complaints for a blessed few minutes. A spoon knocks against wood. A crust is passed. The youngest child has gravy on his chin. Outside, night settles over the yard and the dark fields beyond it. Inside, every mouthful seems to push that darkness back a little. This is what food really means on the frontier in 1830. Not just nourishment, security, planning, worry, thrift, luck, weather, and work brought to the table in edible form. A full pot means the family can breathe easier tonight. A thin one means tomorrow has already become a problem, and so they eat with gratitude, with caution, and with the sober understanding that on the frontier, supper is never only about supper. Distance changes people long before they admit it. On the frontier in 1830 you can measure that distance in miles to the nearest mill, in hours to the nearest doctor, in days to the nearest town. And in the strange silence that settles when the sun goes down and no familiar voice drifts over a fence, a family can work all day among trees, fields, smoke, animals, and children, and still feel the weight of being almost alone. That weight is not always dramatic. Often it arrives quietly. Like dusk filling a room, you feel it most in the spaces between tasks. While carrying water, the path seems longer because no one is coming the other way. While kneading bread, the cabin feels smaller because there is no neighbour likely to step in and borrow salt, ask for news, or sit for a moment by the hearth. On a settled street, human presence announces itself with wheels, doors, voices, and dogs. On a lonely claim, the loudest sounds may be the wind in the timber, a hen objecting to life, or a child singing to herself because the world has grown too still. That stillness could be beautiful. It could also press heavily on the mind. The American frontier was never completely empty, despite the way later stories like to talk. There were native communities, trading routes, scattered farmsteads, cabins half hidden by timber, ferries, mills, roadside taverns, small churches, and growing settlements. Yet for many pioneer families, daily life still felt isolated in a practical and emotional sense. Neighbours might exist, but not nearby enough for casual company. A visit could require an hour on foot, a difficult ride, or a journey delayed by weather, chores, and bad roads. Friendship survived, but it had to work harder. You see this when a visitor finally appears at the cabin after several quiet days. First comes the distant sound of hooves or wagon wheels, then the dog notices, then a child runs to the door, instantly transformed by excitement. A rider emerges between the trees, or a woman in a bonnet comes up the path with a basket on her arm. The whole household shifts. Faces brighten. Someone wipes hands quickly on an apron. A stool is offered. Coffee, if any exists, becomes urgent. News becomes more valuable than sugar. Visits mattered because they carried more than company. They carried connection. A neighbour might bring seed potatoes, a borrowed auger, a recipe for preserving beans, or word that a mill race is running again. She might also bring gossip, which on the frontier functioned partly as the entertainment and partly as social glue. Who has had another child? Whose chimney smokes badly? Whose cow wandered? Who plans to sell land? Who is thinking of moving farther west? Because apparently some people hear the phrase good enough and interpret it as an insult. Information travelled in voices, not headlines, and every visitor was a newspaper with muddy boots. These scattered relationships could become intensely important. In places where families lived far apart, Neighbours often depended on one another for labour and survival. Cabin raisings, harvest help, quilting gatherings, log rollings, hog butchering, and corn huskings all mixed work with sociability. A man might ride miles to help another lift wall logs into place. Women might gather to sew, preserve fruit, or sit up with a sick child. Such gatherings were practical, but they also kept loneliness from hardening too completely. The frontier did not reward people who imagined they could live by grit alone. You notice how differently conversation sounds in such settings. It is fuller, warmer, almost hungry. People speak over one another with relief. Children crowd close. The air smells of cider, wool, sweat, smoke, and fresh-baked bread if someone has made an effort. Hands are busy even while voices rise. Beans are snapped, quilts are pieced. Men sharpen tools or compare the quality of timber and soil with great seriousness, as if discussing philosophy. Women exchange remedies, births, letters, and useful warnings. Laughter comes quicker than it does in solitude, which is one of the many reasons human beings should not be left alone too long with turnips and private thoughts. Religion often helped organize these fragile communities. A circuit preacher might visit rarely, but when he did, families gathered for worship in cabins, barns, or open spaces. Hymns carried over clearings. Prayers joined strangers to one another through shared rhythm and language. Church on the frontier was not always a formal building with polished benches. Often, it was whatever place could hold people long enough to remind them they were part of something larger than their own fence line. Faith offered comfort, certainly, but it also offered a schedule for meeting, a reason to gather, and a respectable excuse to hear everyone's business. Schooling did the same when a schoolhouse appeared. Even a crude one-room building became more than a place for letters and sums. It was a social anchor. Children met other children. Parents exchanged news at pick-up time or on special occasions. A teacher, even a young and overworked one, linked families through a shared hope that their children might gain something steadier than the road and the axe. Historians still disagree about how regularly such institutions served remote frontier populations in every region, because some districts developed quickly while others remained scattered for years. But wherever a school or church took root, it changed the emotional map of the area. Trading places were social centres too. A mill, blacksmith shop, ferry landing, or country store could become the heart of local exchange. Men bringing corn to grind or tools to mend met neighbours, swapped opinions, and heard rumours. Women visiting the store for fabric, tea, or needles encountered other households' needs and triumphs. Children, of course, noticed candy or trinkets first, proving once again that economic life is often best understood through sugar. Even a short trip to a store could feel like re-entering society after weeks of cabin routine. Still, isolation never disappeared entirely. Storms could deepen it. Illness could deepen it more. A sick child in a remote cabin made the world feel enormous and unhelpful. If a doctor lived far away, someone had to ride for him, perhaps in bad weather, perhaps at night, perhaps not knowing whether he would come in time. The cabin then shrank around worry. Every creak of the door mattered. Every hoofbeat in the distance became a question. The same was true in childbirth, injury, or sudden loss. Neighbours might come, and often did. But the hours before help arrived could feel endless. The frontier taught families how far away comfort could be. Women in particular could feel isolation keenly. Domestic labour kept them tied to the cabin and yard, sometimes with small children and little adult company for days at a time. A woman used to sisters, mothers, or close town neighbours might find the silence of a new settlement almost shocking. The woods did not answer back. Chickens were poor conversationalists. Even a strong and capable woman might feel loneliness settle over her while stirring the pot or hanging wash in an empty yard. Some later letters and diaries reveal homesickness so plain it almost hurts to read. Though not everyone wrote it directly, many simply noted visits with unusual gratitude, which may tell you enough. Men felt isolation too, though often in different moments. Long hours clearing, fencing, or hunting could place them physically apart from others and inside their own thoughts. Pride sometimes kept them from naming loneliness. But the hunger for companionship shows up in the enthusiasm for taverns, courthouse days, elections, and any occasion that gathered voices in one place. A man might claim he rode to town for nails and return 3 hours later with nails. News. And a suspiciously satisfied expression. Children experience distance in their own way. With no close companions, siblings became one another's society, rivals, and reluctant best friends. A visit from another family could feel like a festival simply because there were new children to race, quarrel with, and stare at. A lonely child might haunt the lane hoping for company. Another might pour all that social energy into animals, imaginary games, or heroic amounts of talking to adults who were too busy to appreciate the performance fully. There were also strangers, and strangers on the frontier occupied a complicated place between welcome and worry. A traveller asking directions, a peddler with goods, a new settler in search of land, a drifter looking for food, a hired hand moving through the district, all could appear at the door. Hospitality remained a strong expectation in many frontier communities. A meal, a place by the fire, or a spot in the loft might be offered, especially if the stranger seemed decent and the weather mean. Yet caution never slept entirely. A family had few protections beyond judgment, reputation, dogs, and perhaps a firearm. Not every knock at the door brought comfort. One curious detail of frontier visiting is how much importance could attach to the simple act of borrowing. A cup of yeast, a handful of salt, a tool, a skillet, a book, a mule, a seed packet. Borrowing was not merely need. It was relationship. It created threads of obligation and trust that tied households together. Of course, it also created opportunities for irritation when a borrowed item came back late, broken, or smelling strangely of someone else's bacon. Human community has always included both tenderness and petty grievance. The frontier was no exception. Letters bridged distance too, though imperfectly. Mail might arrive irregularly, carried slowly along uncertain routes. A letter from the East could be read aloud more than once, then folded carefully and saved. Paper carried voices across emptiness. It carried births, deaths, marriages, weather complaints, land questions, recipes, money worries, and that peculiar family talent for sounding affectionate and judgmental in the same sentence. Receiving a letter could lift a cabin for days. Writing one could do the same, even before it was sent, because putting life into words made isolation feel briefly answerable. Yet some loneliness could not be cured by letters or visits. It lived in the landscape itself, at dusk. When the chores are done and the last light drains from the field, you can stand outside the cabin and feel the distance pressing outward in every direction. Trees darken into walls, the road vanishes, a single owl calls, smoke rises thin from the chimney and disappears into the cooling air. In such moments, the family exists like a little island of firelight and breath in a very large world. There is beauty in that, yes, but also a shiver of vulnerability. The frontier always kept both. Historians still argue over whether later pioneer memory overstated loneliness, because hardship made for better family legend, or understated it because endurance was a point of pride. The truth likely shifted from household to household, season to season. A lively district with regular gatherings might feel almost neighbourly. A fresh claim at the forest's edge might feel immeasurably solitary. Mood mattered too. A person with work going well, good health, and a recent visit could bear silence differently than one burdened by sickness, crop failure, or grief. Even in better times, community had to be built deliberately. It grew from exchanged labour, shared meals, borrowed tools, common worship, marriages, market days, and repeated acts of showing up. A neighbour who helped raise your barn became more than a neighbour. A woman who sat up all night with your feverish child became kin of a kind no paper could record. A family that welcomed you to their table during your first hard winter entered your memory permanently. On the frontier, belonging was often handmade, just like everything else. As night settles fully, the cabin door closes against the dark. Inside, voices soften, a candle burns low. Somewhere beyond the trees, another family may be doing exactly the same, though far enough away that no light can be seen. That hidden nearness is its own kind of comfort. Not company in the room, but company somewhere in the same rough world. You sit beside the hearth and understand something simple and important. Frontier life was never only a contest between a family and the land. It was also a quiet, ongoing effort to find one another across the distance. Night falls differently on the frontier than it does in a town. In a town, darkness is interrupted by other lives, a lamp across the street, a voice in the lane, a late wagon rolling by. On the frontier in 1830, once the chores are done and the animals settle, the dark gathers with real authority. It rises from the tree line, spreads across the field, leans against the cabin walls, and reminds every soul inside that the circle of firelight is small. In such a world, people hold tightly to the things that steady the mind. Faith is one of them. Fear is another. Small joys matter just as much. You sit in the cabin as evening closes in, and the family shifts from labour to the quieter business of enduring the night. The hearth glows red and gold. A kettle hums softly. The room smells of wood smoke, warm wool, candle wax, and the last traces of supper. A child rubs sleepy eyes. Someone sets the wooden bar across the door more from habit than danger, though habit often grows out of danger's older shadow. The day has been full of practical tasks, yet night invites larger thoughts. And larger thoughts can be troublesome company when the nearest neighbour is distant and the wind has begun to sound uncertain around the roof. For many pioneer families, religion shaped the rhythm of life in ways both formal and intimate. A Bible on the shelf was not merely a book. It was moral guide, comfort object, family record, and evening companion. Pages held marriages, births, and deaths written in careful script. Verses were read aloud by firelight. Prayers were said over meals, over children, over journeys, over illness, and over graves. On the frontier, faith did not remove hardship. It gave hardship a language. It allowed a family to imagine that their labour, losses, and hopes were seen by something greater than weather and chance. You hear that faith in the low murmur of evening prayer. The father, perhaps, clears his throat and reads a passage, or the mother leads a simpler blessing with children half listening and half fighting sleep. The words float into the smoky air and settle over the room. They are familiar words, repeated often enough to smooth the edges of fear. A little girl's voice joins late and gets 2 phrases wrong. No one minds. The point is not polish. The point is presence. Religious life on the frontier could also be vivid and communal when families gathered. Camp meetings, revivals, circuit preachers, and cabin services brought emotion, singing, and public devotion into scattered settlements. A preacher might arrive dusty, tired, and determined, carrying scripture and a talent for speaking to people who had worked all week and still wanted to hear that life meant more than labour. Hymns sung in a rough cabin or clearing could be deeply moving. Human voices rose together against distance and darkness. Even those who were less devout often valued the gathering itself, because it offered meaning, news, and a chance to be among others without having to pretend the world was easy. Yet faith on the frontier was rarely serene all the time. It lived beside superstition, rumour, and old inherited fears that respectable people did not always admit in daylight. A family might trust in providence and still nail up a horseshoe, avoid certain paths after dark, or whisper about signs that trouble was coming. The owl that called too near the house, the dog that howled at nothing, the strange dream before a death, the mirror covered after a loss. Human beings are very good at carrying both doctrine and unease in the same pocket. Historians still argue about how deeply superstition shaped everyday frontier behaviour, because people did not always write about it plainly. They might record an omen with a wink, or mention it only after events seem to confirm it. But the pattern appears often enough to matter. In uncertain worlds, people search for signs. The frontier was uncertain, almost by definition. Fear itself wore many faces. Some were practical. Fire in the chimney, a child taken sick in the night, a horse gone lame, wolves near the stock, a storm rising hard and fast, water running low, the corn failing. These fears had shape and reason. Others were less tidy. The sound outside the cabin that might be a branch or might be more. The loneliness that turns every creak into an event. The worry, rarely spoken directly, that all this labour may still not be enough. Frontier families lived close to necessity, and necessity has a way of keeping the imagination slightly raw. You feel that rawness when the wind picks up after dark. The cabin roof answers with little sounds of strain and settling. The fire shifts. Smoke hesitates at the chimney mouth before finding its way upward. A child looks toward the door. Another asks whether the storm will be bad. Adults answer calmly, because adults on the frontier become performers whenever children are afraid. Still, calm words do not stop everyone from listening more closely to the weather. The smell of rain may already be in the air, cool and metallic. The candle flame bends and rights itself. Outside, leaves begin to hiss. Then there are the quieter fears, the ones that sit in a person after the work is done, a mother thinking of a fever her child had last winter, a father counting debts in his head while pretending to watch the fire, an older woman missing people buried far away, a young wife wondering whether she will ever again live near sisters, cousins, or familiar bells. Night makes room for thoughts that daylight chores keep at bay. The frontier had many practical burdens, but its emotional burdens could be just as heavy when silence settled in, and still people found ways to lighten those hours. A song helped. A joke helped too. A story might help most of all. You hear one begin now, with the children gathered close, and the fire casting shadows that make the walls look taller than they are. Perhaps it is a Bible story told plainly. Perhaps a tale from the old home back east. Perhaps a bit of frontier humour involving a stubborn mule, a boastful hunter, or a preacher who lost an argument with a rainstorm. Gentle teasing was part of cabin life. So was dry humour, the sort that grows naturally among tired people who cannot afford despair, and therefore make fun of everything from bad bread to worse weather. Laughter in a frontier cabin sounds especially warm. It bounces off log walls. It makes the room feel fuller. It even changes the smell of the place somehow, though that may only be imagination. A child giggles so hard she hiccups. The father smiles without meaning to. The mother, who has spent all day working, allows herself a brief soft laugh that makes everyone else relax. Small joy on the frontier is often not grand pleasure. It is release. Music offered another kind of relief. Singing after supper, whether sacred or light-hearted, helped pass the evening and knit the family together. Not every household had an instrument, but some had fiddles, dulcimers, or simple flutes. More often, they had voices, a hymn, a ballad, a lullaby, or a silly rhyme could turn the close cabin air tender. Sound mattered in such spaces. The crackle of the hearth, the murmur of melody, the sleepy breathing of children, the occasional patter of rain on the roof. These sounds told the family it was held together for one more night. One quirky frontier truth is that even simple treats could take on enormous emotional importance. A bit of molasses on bread, roasted chestnuts in season, a handful of berries saved for the children, a candle burned a little longer than necessary, a ribbon brought from town, a letter read aloud again just because it was nice to hear familiar names. In a life measured by need, modest pleasures shone brightly. People did not require luxury to feel delight. They required rarity. Holiday celebrations mattered for the same reason. Christmas, New Year, harvest gatherings, weddings, corn huskings, and quilting bees all broke the sameness of toil. A special meal, extra pies, fiddle music, dancing, games, or simply a large gathering of neighbours could brighten a season that had grown too stern. Children remembered these moments keenly. Adults did too, though they sometimes disguised it under talk of travel distance, and how much wood still needed splitting. Even hard people enjoy cake when they can get it. Courtship and marriage brought their own softer glow to frontier society. A young man riding over to visit, a girl pretending not to look out the window before he arrives, families sitting in the same room while the conversation tiptoes around the obvious. Such evenings mixed tenderness and supervision in equal measure. Privacy was not a frontier specialty. Still, affection found room to breathe. A new ribbon, a carved keepsake, a song sung a little too earnestly. These small gestures could carry great weight in a world where possessions were few and intentions had to be practical. Children created joy almost accidentally. A made-up song while shelling beans, a game played with chestnuts, a baby's first steps across the cabin floor, causing adults to cheer as if national greatness itself had appeared in stockings. a boy's solemn attempt to mimic his father's prayer voice, a little girl dressing a cornhusk doll with scraps of cloth and presenting it like royalty. These moments did not remove hardship, but they interrupted it. That mattered. Nature, too, no warrant, could offer comfort as well as fear. The same night sky that made a family feel small could also fill them with wonder. Step outside after the fire is banked and the stars spread overhead in impossible numbers. The air smells cool, damp, and faintly sweet from the grass. Crickets pulse in the dark. Somewhere near the creek, frogs keep up their endless conference. A moonlit clearing can seem almost gentle. Silver laid across stumps and fence rails. The cabin roof pale against the trees. Frontier people were not always admiring scenery in a poetic trance, but they did live close enough to natural beauty that it could strike them quietly, even after a day of plain exhaustion. There were also moments of solemn reflection. The reading of a psalm after a burial, a prayer of thanks after recovery from illness, the naming of a child, the marking of a Sabbath in a rough place. These acts gave shape to time. Without them, one day of labour could melt too easily into the next. Ritual made frontier life feel less accidental. It arranged joy and grief into something the family could carry. Of course, not every household was equally devout, equally cheerful, or equally haunted by fear. Some were more light-hearted, some more stern, some leaned hard on religion, some on humour, some on routine, some on sheer stubborn silence. The frontier did not produce one kind of spirit any more than it produced one kind of cabin. But nearly every family needed some inward store of meaning and comfort, because the outward world could be rough, indifferent, and terribly long. As the night deepens, the children begin to fade one by one. A head slips onto a mother's lap. A boy sprawls near the hearth with one shoe half off. The candle shortens. The fire settles into a bed of deep orange coals. The adults speak more softly now, their words slower, as though the dark has placed a hand over the room and asked for quiet. Outside, the wind has dropped. The roof no longer complains. The whole cabin seems to breathe. You sit with them in that pause between anxiety and sleep and understand something essential. Pioneer families did not endure by strength alone. They endured by prayer spoken into smoky air, by songs remembered in tired voices, by jokes told at exactly the right moment, by a child's laughter, by the sweetness of a rare treat, by shared rituals that made the wilderness feel less final. Fear was present. Yes, it always was. But so were faith and small joys, and together they gave the night a gentler shape. The frontier asks for a price from everyone, and it does not bother to keep the bill itemized. That may be the plainest truth of life for pioneer families on the American frontier in 1830. You can arrive with hope packed tightly beside the meal sacks and seed corn. You can work until your hands harden, your back stiffens, and your clothes smell permanently of smoke, sweat, and weather. You can build a cabin, plant the field, mend the fence, bury the dead, welcome the new, and keep the fire going through nights that seem made of iron. Yet even after all that, the frontier still takes something. Sometimes it takes comfort. Sometimes it takes ease. Sometimes it takes much more than that. By evening, you stand just outside the cabin and look over the claim in the falling light. The place has changed under the family's labour. There is a path to the water, a stack of wood against the wall, a patch of garden, a rail fence beginning to define itself, and a yard worn bare by many feet. Smoke rises from the chimney in a thin grey line. A cow shifts near the pen. Hens mutter themselves toward roost. At a glance, it might look like success. And in one sense, it is. The family has not vanished into hardship. It has made a life here. But the cost of that life is written everywhere once you know how to read it. It is in the father's shoulders, which no longer roll freely when he stands. It is in the mother's hands, roughened by lye, hot iron, and endless washing. The knuckles red in winter, the fingertips nicked from knives and needles. It is in the older children, who laugh like children and work like something older. It is in the grandmother's tired eyes when weather turns cold and damp. The frontier does not always ruin people spectacularly. More often, It wears them down one ordinary day at a time. The myth of the pioneer family often prefers clean heroics. Log cabin, sunrise, sturdy wagons, grateful children, and a kind of cheerful hardship that somehow flatters everyone involved. The reality was harsher, quieter, and more human. Pioneer families got sick, they argued, they made mistakes, they regretted decisions, they felt lonely, frightened, overworked, and trapped by choices already made. The frontier was not a pageant of noble suffering. It was a grinding experiment in endurance conducted by ordinary people who were sometimes admirable and sometimes simply too committed to turn back. You hear that reality in the cabin at night, when the fire is burned lower and the day's performance of competence begins to slip. A father counts what is left of the powder, the flour, or the money. A mother measures cloth and sees it is not enough for what must be mended. A child coughs in sleep and the whole room grows more alert. Someone mentions the weather. Someone else falls quiet because weather is never only weather. It is planting, harvest, roof leaks, muddy roads, sick animals, and whether the family will eat well or narrowly in the coming months. Loss on the frontier often arrived without ceremony. A crop failed, a baby died, a horse broke a leg, a fever spread, a storm flattened what took months to build. The cost of frontier life was not only dramatic tragedy, though there was certainly enough of that. It was also accumulation. Too many thin winters, too many close calls, too many mornings waking already tired. Historians still argue over how much later memory transformed these hardships into proud family legend, and how much it softened them. Old age enjoys a story of resilience. It is less eager to describe the smell of fear in a cabin where medicine has run out and help is far away. There is also the moral cost, though people in 1830 did not always speak of it plainly. Settler life on the American frontier unfolded on lands already inhabited and used by native peoples. The notion of empty wilderness was a fantasy convenient to expansion and deeply false. Pioneer families often saw themselves as struggling innocents simply trying to survive, and on one level many were exactly that. Yet their survival was tied to a larger national movement of dispossession, removal, and violence. The cabin and the plough did not arrive in a moral vacuum. They arrived inside a much larger conflict over land, sovereignty, and belonging. That does not make individual family suffering unreal. It makes the frontier story more complicated than comfort usually allows. You feel some of that complication in the land itself. A path once used by others now leads to the family's spring. Timber cut for a cabin once stood in a forest woven into older patterns of use and memory. A field opened by settler labour may still contain traces of lives the family does not understand or perhaps prefers not to see clearly. The frontier was both intimate and political, though many families experienced only the intimate part and left the larger truth for historians to untangle later. Even within the household, the cost was unevenly paid. Men often faced the most visible burdens, clearing land, building structures, managing stock, and taking on debts or legal claims. Women carried a different but equally relentless load, turning scarcity into meals, cloth, cleanliness, and care, often without praise equal to the effort. Children gave up a long protected childhood in exchange for usefulness. Elderly family members gave up familiarity, comfort, and sometimes health. A pioneer household might survive because everyone sacrificed, but not everyone sacrificed in the same currency. One curious and slightly bitter truth is that success on the frontier could create fresh labour rather than rest. More cleared land meant more fencing, more livestock meant more feeding, milking, and mending of pens. Better harvests meant more storing, drying, shelling, and guarding. A larger family meant more hands eventually, but first it meant more mouths, more washing, more cloth, more worry. Progress was rarely a peaceful plateau. It was usually a new staircase built out of chores. Still, families stayed. Many stayed because they had little choice. To leave could mean admitting failure, losing improvements, or facing the same long road in reverse with fewer resources than before. Others stayed because, for all the hardship, the place slowly became theirs in ways that mattered. A fruit tree survived and took root. A child learned to walk on that cabin floor. A daughter married nearby. A fence line began to feel familiar. A grave was dug on the edge of the clearing, and after that the ground held part of the family in the deepest possible way. Belonging is not always love. Sometimes it is labour invested too deeply to uproot. You see the cost in memory too. A woman needing bread may pause because the smell of autumn apples reminds her of an orchard back east she will never see again. A man hearing church singing at a gathering may think of voices now gone. A child who grows into adulthood on the frontier may later realise how much of life was shaped by work, weather, and necessity before he ever had words for those forces. The frontier leaves marks not only on the body, but on what people expect from the world. It teaches caution, thrift, resilience, and silence. It can also teach hardness, suspicion, and the habit of carrying on because pausing feels dangerous. And yet, despite all this, there is hope still alive in the cabin. Not foolish hope, stubborn hope, the kind that survives because it has been forced to do so. You see it when seed is saved carefully for spring, when a patch on a child's coat is sewn neatly, not anyhow, when a mother plants flowers beside beans, when a father repairs a gate before sleep instead of leaving it for morning, when a girl practices her letters after a full day of chores, when a family plans for winter as if winter can indeed be met and managed. Hope on the frontier is rarely loud. It is built into practical acts performed with a steady hand. There were rewards, too, and they should not be dismissed. Land ownership could transform a family's future in a way few other opportunities could at the time. A successful farm might feed children better than their parents had been fed. A family that endured the brutal first years could become established, respected, even prosperous by local standards. A cabin could grow into a house. A track could become a road. A cluster of claims could become a village with a school, a store, and a church bell. The frontier cost much, but it also offered real possibilities, which is why so many people kept going despite every warning written in mud, smoke, and fatigue. Historians continue to disagree about whether the pioneer ideal should be admired mainly for resilience or examined mainly for its entanglement with expansion and inequality. The honest answer is that it must be both. The daily courage of ordinary families was real. So were the larger forces of speculation, removal, and national ambition that shaped where and how those families lived. Simplifying either side turns history into comfort food, and frontier life was rarely comfortable enough to deserve that treatment. As darkness settles over the claim, the family gathers inside the cabin. The walls catch firelight in rough gold bands. Supper smells plain but warm. A child leans against a parent's knee, already heavy with sleep. Outside, the field fades into shadow, the fence dissolves into dark, and the whole world seems to narrow again to this little room, this small flame, these tired people. You realise then that the frontier did not make families into legends while they were living it. It made them into survivors, mourners, workers, parents, children, neighbours, and weary human beings doing their best inside a hard bargain. The bargain was this: work more than you thought possible, lose more than you expected, love what you managed to build, fear how quickly it can vanish, and keep going anyway. That was the cost. That was also the strange, stubborn power of frontier family life in 1830. Now the night grows gentler, the last chores are done, the kettle has stopped singing, the fire has settled into a bed of low red coals, breathing soft heat into the cabin. Outside, the dark lies quiet over the yard, over the cut stumps, over the field rows, over the path to the spring, and over the trees standing patient beyond the clearing. The air smells faintly of ash, cooling earth, and the worn sweetness of dried grass. You let your thoughts slow. The family, too, is slowing now. A mother folds one last cloth and lays it aside. A father checks the door and then sits without speaking. Children have drifted into sleep wherever sleep found them easiest. One with a hand curled beneath a cheek, another turned toward the hearth, another breathing softly beneath a patched quilt. Their faces look younger in firelight. The day's burdens eased for a few quiet hours. The cabin is rough, but it is warm enough. The world outside is wide, but it can wait until morning. A cricket pulses in the dark beyond the wall. Somewhere farther off, water moves over stones with that endless hush that belongs to creeks and to time itself. The sound mingles with the faint settling of the roof beams and the soft rhythm of sleeping breath. Nothing asks to be solved now. Nothing needs lifting, mending, chopping, stirring, or carrying in this moment. You rest your gaze on the glow of the coals and let the frontier recede from struggle into stillness. The wagon roads are quiet, the fields are dim, the tools are put away. The hands that built, washed, planted, cooked, carried, and comforted can finally be still. And as the red light fades lower and the cabin drifts deeper into shadow, you're left with only warmth, darkness, and the peaceful feeling of a hard day ended at last. End of script. Sleep well. Taucho toina moi prompt bangtiangan fanan tuan bo, nu dunko truyen ban vua viet. Tatka kes prompt fai jong had boi kan, guanao. Niet vetran pai jung toi kiteo no dunko truyen yu kaujo fai viet vau tung prompt. Prompt kong vi pamchin saach gua visk gua Google. Moi prompt viet lien makvakachin haumo donkyu akak prompt. Jopan kiai tamika. Jansui nangitrong ve gie duoi jelana moi prompt bang tieng an. Jong hat ve boy kan. Trang fuk va fong cash hin an. Bam sa tuan bokau chuyen ve kaskia jin tien fong tren bien gioi. Mena mot ngin tam tramba moi. Moi prompt juok viet hin match. An tuan kong shua yuta pan kam. Va jen shen yo ka va jo pan gie tam ka vau tung prompt. A calm cinematic scene of an American pioneer family in 1830 preparing to leave their small eastern homestead at dawn. Wooden wagon loaded with seed sacks, iron pots, rolled quilts, rough wooden chests, and simple tools. Father in homespun linen shirt, wool trousers, suspenders and worn leather boots. Mother in long plain cotton dress, apron, shawl and bonnet. Children in modest patch frontier clothing, realistic historical details, early 19th century American frontier setting, soft golden morning light, muted earthy palette, historically accurate clothing and objects, detailed storybook realism, painterly yet realistic brushwork, 8K, an 1830 American frontier family standing silently in the yard of a nearly emptied farmhouse before departure. Open door, stacked chairs, feather bedding tied with rope, grandmother seated with a tin cup and wool shawl, children glancing between fear and excitement, period-correct homespun garments, bonnets, linen shirts, wool skirts, leather shoes, historically accurate pioneer household objects, soft misty morning, emotional but gentle mood, cinematic historical realism, painterly illustration with fine textures, 8K, a detailed pioneer wagon packing scene on the American frontier in 1830, mother carefully arranging blankets around crockery, father testing the wagon wheel, children holding a rag doll and a small carved toy, seed bags, rope, tools, Dutch oven, Bible, candle molds, and wooden utensils placed with care. Everyone in historically accurate 1830 frontier clothing, plain fabrics, practical layers, dusty boots, warm natural daylight, realistic and historically grounded artwork, cinematic painterly realism 8K, a close view of an 1830 frontier wagon filled with household essentials only, cornmeal sacks, salt pork barrel, iron kettle, folded quilts, broad axe, handsaw, spinning wheel parts, Bible, simple clothing bundles, no modern items, authentic American pioneer family clothing in homespun woolen linen, subdued rustic color palette, early Republic frontier atmosphere, highly detailed historical painting style with realistic textures, 8K. An American pioneer family saying farewell to neighbors before heading west in 1830 muddy yard, simple handshake. Women exchanging herb packets and flower seeds, children climbing into the wagon, everyone wearing accurate frontier-era clothing, bonnets, aprons, shawls, linen shirts, waistcoats, wool trousers, soft, overcast light, emotional restraint, historically faithful environment, cinematic, painterly realism, 8K, a frontier wagon beginning to roll away from a modest farmhouse in 1830 America, horses straining, muddy wheels, chimney fading into the distance, child looking back at the house, orchard bare in early spring, family dressed in correct early 19th century frontier clothing, detailed historical landscape, quiet melancholy, naturalistic colours, realistic brushwork, cinematic composition. 8. K. A roadside camp on the American frontier in 1830 at dusk. Pioneer family making first camp beside their wagon. Blankets spread on uneven ground, kettle over a small fire, horses tied nearby, children half asleep, mother in bonnet and long work dress, father in linen shirt and suspenders, smoky twilight atmosphere, historically accurate gear and clothing, calm immersive historical realism, painterly cinematic style. 8K. A pioneer family crossing a shallow stream with a loaded wagon on the American frontier in 1830, horses stepping carefully through the water, mother clutching bedding bundle, father guiding the team, children peering out anxiously, accurate early 19th century frontier clothing and equipment, wet wood, moving current, muddy banks, realistic historical painting, gentle dramatic tension. 8K. An overland travel scene in 1830 America with a pioneer wagon moving along a rutted dirt road through forest and open land. Adults walking beside the wagon to spare the horses. Children under canvas cover. Dust on clothing and faces. Authentic frontier garments in muted browns. Creams and faded blues. Realistic wilderness road. Cinematic historical realism with painterly detail. 8K. A rainstorm hitting an 1830 pioneer family on the road west. Canvas wagon cover soaked, mother shielding children, father struggling with the team in muddy road conditions, wet wool dresses, linen shirts clinging from rain, dark thunderclouds, historically correct wagon and harness details, dramatic but gentle frontier atmosphere, realistic painterly illustration. 8K. A muddy roadside camp after a storm on the American frontier in 1830. Low smoky fire, damp blankets, tired children warming hands, mother checking supplies for moisture, father cutting branches for shelter, period-correct frontier clothing and objects, earthy wet textures, soft evening light after rain, immersive historical realism. 8K. A wide view of multiple pioneer travellers on the American frontier road in 1830 wagons, pack animals, scattered families, roadside tavern in the distance, everyone dressed in authentic early 19th century American frontier clothes, practical linen and wool garments, broad hats, bonnets, aprons, realistic terrain and atmosphere, cinematic painterly history scene. 8K. An arrival scene at a newly claimed frontier clearing in 1830 America. Family pausing beside the wagon and staring at stumps. Cut brush, rough earth, and surrounding timber. Distant creek visible through trees. Mother holding a child. Father studying the land. Historically accurate pioneer clothing. Subdued natural colours. Emotionally quiet. Realistic painterly illustration. 8K. A pioneer family building a temporary lean to beside their wagon on the American frontier in 1830 canvas stretched between poles. Quilts hung for wind protection. Children gathering sticks. Mother organising bedding. Father driving support stakes. Accurate frontier clothing and materials. Raw woodland clearing. Calm survival mood. Detailed historical realism. 8K. Men felling trees for a log cabin in 1830 frontier America. Father and older son chopping a straight trunk with axes, wood chips flying, mother carrying water pail nearby, children keeping distance, all in authentic homespun frontier garments. No modern tools. Fresh sap smell implied through vivid detail. Cinematic painterly realism. 8K. A log cabin wall rising in a frontier clearing in 1830. Men lifting notched logs into place with handspikes. Women preparing food at a nearby fire. Children stacking kindling, historically accurate American pioneer clothing, long dresses, aprons, bonnets, linen shirts, wool trousers, realistic early 19th century construction details, warm afternoon light. 8K. A newly built but unfinished log cabin on the American frontier in 1830 rough doorway, dirt floor, gaps between logs, simple bed frame and table inside, smoke curling from a clay-plastered stick chimney, family gathered within, all wearing historically faithful frontier clothing, intimate firelight, realistic painterly storybook style, 8K, an interior of a one-room frontier log cabin in 1830 America at night. Rough log walls, packed earth floor, homemade shelf with tin cups, Bible, iron pot by the hearth, children asleep under patchwork quilts, mother in bonnet and plain dress seated by candlelight, father resting nearby in work clothes, warm, smoky realism, historically accurate painterly detail, 8K, a frontier woman in 1830, America rekindling the morning fire inside a log cabin, kneeling by the hearth, blowing gently into ashes, kettle ready. Children asleep in the dim room, long plain cotton dress, apron, shawl, historical realism, soft cold dawn light against warm coals, painterly cinematic detail, 8K. A hard-working pioneer mother preparing breakfast in a frontier cabin in 1830, stirring cornmeal mush while bacon cooks in an iron skillet. Baby nearby. Children waking, rough log walls, simple wooden utensils, accurate early 19th century frontier clothing, authentic domestic details, intimate warm firelight realism, 8K. A frontier woman carrying heavy wooden water buckets from a woodland spring in 1830 America. Narrow dirt path, cool shade, bonnet, shawl, plain long dress, sturdy leather shoes, realistic pioneer household labour, historically accurate setting and costume, calm natural atmosphere, cinematic painterly realism, 8K, a laundry day scene on the American frontier in 1830 woman, washing clothes in a steaming iron kettle outside the cabin, linens hung on a line, children helping nearby, log cabin and wood pile in the background, accurate frontier garments and household tools, soap making and washing details, soft daylight, detailed historical realism, 8K. A pioneer woman sewing by candlelight inside a log cabin in 1830 America, mending a child's shirt while the family rests nearby, rough stool, patch basket, folded fabrics, warm amber light, authentic homespun dress, apron, bonnet set aside, period-correct frontier interior, intimate painterly realism. 8K, a butter churning scene in an 1830 frontier cabin yard, woman working the churn beside the doorway, child holding eggs, another child watching the hens, father splitting wood in the distance, all in historically accurate American frontier clothing, rustic domestic life, natural earthy palette, realistic painterly style, 8K. A kitchen garden beside a frontier cabin in 1830 America, mother and daughter tending beans, onions, squash and herbs, simple fence, stumps still in the yard, both in authentic long work dresses, aprons and bonnets, cabin and smokehouse nearby, historically grounded rural atmosphere, detailed cinematic realism, 8K. Children on the American frontier in 1830 carrying kindling, gathering eggs and helping with chores near a log cabin, patched clothing, bare feet or worn shoes, plain linen shirts, simple dresses, realistic early 19th century domestic yard, chickens, dog, woodpile, gentle warm daylight, painterly historical realism, 8K. A group of frontier children in 1830 America learning letters inside a log cabin, older sister helping younger siblings read from a Bible and primer by the fire, slate and chalk on a rough table, authentic pioneer clothing and cabin interior, soft afternoon light, historically accurate educational scene, realistic painterly style, 8K. Frontier children at play in 1830 near a cabin yard, cornhusk dolls, stick toys, smooth stones for games, dog joining them, simple patched pioneer clothing, realistic log cabin background, late afternoon summer light, period-correct American frontier atmosphere, storybook realism with historical accuracy, 8K. A young frontier boy in 1830 scaring birds from a corn patch while wearing a linen shirt, patched trousers and suspenders, rough field, split-rail fence, nearby cabin and timber edge, authentic American pioneer setting, warm sunlight, detailed realistic painting with soft cinematic mood, 8K. An older frontier girl in 1830 America caring for a younger sibling while helping shell beans outside the cabin, both in modest period-correct clothing, baskets, garden produce, simple domestic tools, cabin doorway behind them, historically faithful rural atmosphere, painterly realism, 8K. A frontier supper scene in 1830 with a family gathered around a rough wooden table inside a log cabin. Bowls of beans and cornmeal, a small piece of pork, candlelight and hearth glow. Everyone in authentic pioneer garments, emotionally warm but modest. Historically accurate food and interior details, realistic painterly style, 8K. A close detailed still life of frontier food supplies in 1830 America. Cornmeal sack, dried beans, salt pork, onions, pumpkin, tin cups, rough bread, wooden spoon, iron kettle. No modern items. Early 19th century American frontier domestic style, muted earthy colours, realistic painterly texture, 8K. A frontier family harvesting and preserving food in autumn, 1830 pumpkins, dried apples, corn hanging, smokehouse in the background, mother slicing fruit, father carrying corn, children helping gather beans, historically accurate clothing and farm details, golden autumn light, painterly cinematic realism, 8K. A maple sugar boiling scene in early spring on the American frontier in 1830, family gathered near steaming kettles beneath sugar maples, children watching eagerly, simple frontier clothing in wool and linen layers, forest edge, soft, cool light, historically accurate early American rural setting, realistic painterly detail, 8K. A winter frontier cabin scene in 1830 America, family eating a modest meal by the hearth while snow lies outside. Simple stored food, thick quilts, wool shawls, heavy homespun clothing, firelight against rough log walls, quiet endurance, historically accurate pioneer atmosphere, detailed cinematic realism, 8K. A neighbour arriving on horseback at a remote frontier cabin in 1830 dog barking, children rushing to the doorway, mother welcoming the visitor, father stepping from the yard, all in period-correct pioneer clothing, log cabin, woodpile and muddy path, emotionally warm rural isolation, painterly historical realism, 8K. A frontier social gathering in 1830 America with neighbours helping raise a cabin, men lifting logs, women preparing food and talking, children playing nearby, all in authentic early 19th century frontier dress, woodland clearing, cooperative pioneer community, lively but gentle atmosphere, richly detailed painterly realism, 8K. A quilting gathering inside a frontier cabin in 1830, several women in plain long dresses, aprons and bonnets sewing together while children sit nearby, hearth lit warmly, simple wooden furniture, historically correct textiles and interior, intimate social life on the frontier, cinematic painterly realism, 8K. A simple frontier worship scene in 1830 America, families gathered inside a cabin for evening prayer and hymn singing, Bible open, candlelight, plain homespun clothing, respectful calm expressions, log walls and rough benches, historically accurate American pioneer religious life, soft painterly realism, 8K. A circuit preacher visiting a frontier settlement in 1830 families gathered outdoors near cabins and wagons, men, women and children in authentic early 19th century frontier clothing listening quietly, woodland clearing, simple, reverent mood, historically accurate American setting, cinematic painterly style, 8K. A night scene inside a frontier cabin in 1830, family gathered around the hearth telling stories and singing softly, children sleepy under quilts, mother smiling faintly, father seated in linen shirt and suspenders, candle and firelight, authentic period clothing and cabin details, warm, emotional painterly realism, 8K. A gentle frontier holiday gathering in 1830 America, neighbours sharing a modest feast with pies, bread and cider outside a cabin, fiddle music implied, simple dancing and smiling children, everyone in historically accurate pioneer clothing, rustic decorations, warm late autumn evening light, cinematic painterly realism, 8K. A quiet frontier courtship scene in 1830. Young man visiting a cabin at dusk, horse tied outside, young woman in plain long dress by the doorway, family visible inside by firelight, period correct clothing and architecture, respectful and gentle atmosphere, historically accurate American pioneer life, 8K. A lonely frontier evening in 1830 America. Woman standing outside a log cabin at twilight looking into the tree line. Smoke rising from the chimney. Field rose fading into dusk. Bonnet and shawl moving in soft wind. Historically accurate clothing and setting, reflective mood. Painterly cinematic realism, 8K. A stormy night around a frontier cabin in 1830, wind bending the trees. Family gathered anxiously but safely inside by the hearth. Candle flicker. Children close to parents. Rough log walls and clay chimney. Accurate pioneer clothing and interior details. Moody but calm historical realism, 8K. A tender scene of a frontier father carving a small wooden toy by the cabin door in evening light. Child watching closely. Mother in the background folding cloth. All in historically accurate 1830 American frontier clothing. Rough yard. Wood shavings, simple domestic peace, painterly realistic style, 8K. A mature frontier homestead in 1830 America after years of labour. Log cabin, fenced garden, stacked firewood, small orchard, livestock pen, smokehouse. Family standing together in worn but tidy homespun clothing. Visible signs of hard work and endurance. Soft sunset light, historically faithful cinematic realism, 8K, a reflective close family portrait on the American frontier in 1830. Father with weathered face, mother with roughened hands, children in patched but clean clothing, log cabin interior behind them, firelight illuminating quiet resilience. All costumes and settings strictly period correct. Painterly historical realism, 8K, a peaceful late evening inside a frontier cabin in 1830 America. Children asleep under handmade quilts. Mother setting aside folded cloth. Father checking the barred door. Low red coals in the hearth. Rough log walls glowing softly. Authentic early 19th century pioneer clothing and household items. Calming cinematic realism, 8K. A final, serene nighttime view of an 1830 American frontier cabin after a long day. Soft smoke from the chimney. Moonlight over stumps. Garden. Path to the spring, and silent field. Warm glow from within. Historically accurate pioneer family life implied through the setting. Gentle painterly realism. Muted earthy palette. Storybook historical atmosphere. 8K. Niu ben mion toiko dielam tiepcho ben modbonam. Mui prompt kak theo huang. Jong hat nu transon dauko jin huag. Jong hat nu cinematic realistic concept art. Your whisk chora hin hong hat hono. Get smarter responses, upload files and images, and more. Log in, sign up for free. Voice we use cookies. Cookies help this site function, measure usage, and support marketing. Manage your cookie preferences anytime. Learn more about our cookie policy. Reject non-essential. Accept all.